Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today we will be listening to 3 soothing true war stories to make you fall asleep. Story 1. The Lafayette Escadrille. Americans in the Air. The roar of engines filled the crisp morning air as the men of the Lafayette Escadrille prepared for another day in the skies. It was the spring of 1916, and the war had been raging for almost 2 years. For these American volunteers, the call to arms had come early, long before the United States entered the conflict. Driven by a sense of adventure and a desire to aid France, they had crossed the Atlantic to join the fight against the Central Powers. Lieutenant William Thaw stood by his Newport 11 biplane, checking the wires and struts with meticulous care. The Pennsylvania native was one of the first Americans to join the French Air Service, and his leadership would soon make him a key figure in the formation of the Lafayette Escadrille. Beside him, Raoul Lufbery, a seasoned aviator with a fierce reputation, was adjusting his flight gear. Born in France but raised in America, Lufbery embodied the spirit of the unit, a blend of cultures united by a common cause. As the pilots gathered for their briefing, Captain Georges Zenol, their French commander, outlined the day's mission. The escadrille had been tasked with patrolling the skies over Verdun, a hotly contested sector where fierce battles raged below. The men listened intently, their faces a mix of determination and excitement. For many, the war had become a personal quest, a way to prove their valor and fight for the ideals they held dear. The skies over Verdun were a swirling mass of smoke and fire as the Lafayette Escadrille took to the air. The sound of artillery echoed from the ground, mingling with the crackle of machine gun fire. Lieutenant Thaw led the formation, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. Within minutes, they spotted a group of German Albatross fighters diving towards them. Thaw signaled to his men, and the air was filled with the sharp rattle of gunfire as the 2 squadrons clashed. Raoul Lufbery, his instincts honed by countless hours in the cockpit, maneuvered his Newport with precision, lining up his sights on a German plane. He speed-locked up the horn of his plane and hied and gathered his troops together, looking through the enemy fuselage, sending it spiraling towards the ground. The battle was intense, with planes darting and weaving in a deadly dance. For the men of the Lafayette Escadrille, this was their baptism by fire. Each pilot faced the harsh reality of aerial combat, the split-second decisions, the ever-present danger, and the constant need for vigilance. As the engagement wore on, they began to understand the true nature of the war they had joined. After the harrowing dogfight, the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille returned to their base, their planes battered but intact. The camaraderie among the men was palpable as they gathered in the mess tent, recounting the day's events and celebrating their victories. The shared experiences of combat had forged a bond that transcended their individual backgrounds and nationalities. James McConnell, a former ambulance driver from North Carolina, raised his glass in a toast. "To the escadrille," he declared, his voice filled with pride. The others joined in, their spirits lifted by the sense of accomplishment and unity. McConnell's journey from the battlefields of the Western Front to the skies above had been marked by a deep sense of purpose, and he found solace in the company of his fellow aviators. The pilots spent the evening in a mixture of laughter and reflection, aware that each mission could be their last. They shared stories of home, dreams for the future, and the ever-present hope for peace. As the night wore on, the bonds of brotherhood grew stronger, solidifying their resolve to continue the fight. Despite the camaraderie, the reality of war was never far from their minds. The next morning brought news of losses from other units, a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. The men of the Lafayette Escadrille steeled themselves for the challenges ahead, knowing that each day could bring new trials. Victor Chapman, one of the first American pilots to die in combat, had been a close friend to many in the unit. His death in June 1916 had left a void that was keenly felt by all. The memory of Chapman's bravery and sacrifice served as a powerful motivator, driving the men to honor his legacy through their own actions. As they prepared for another mission, the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille were acutely aware of the thin line between life and death. The war had taken a heavy toll, but it had also revealed their inner strength and resilience. In the face of adversity, they found the courage to press on, determined to make a difference in the fight for freedom. Life at the escadrille's base was a blend of routine and unpredictability. Each day began with a briefing where Captain Zeynault would outline the day's objectives and assign roles. The pilots would then conduct pre-flight checks, ensuring their aircraft were in peak condition for the missions ahead. Between sorties, the men found ways to occupy their time and maintain their morale. They played cards, read letters from home, and engaged in spirited debates about the war and their place in it. The presence of the unit's mascots, a pair of lion cubs named Whiskey and Soda, provided a welcome distraction, their playful antics bringing moments of joy and levity. The constant cycle of action and downtime created a rhythm that helped the pilots cope with the stress of combat. They learned to cherish the quiet moments, knowing that the next mission could be their most dangerous yet. The resilience they developed in these times of calm would serve them well in the many battles to come. The men of the Lafayette Escadrille quickly learned that success in aerial combat required not only skill, but also a deep understanding of tactics. Captain Zeynault, drawing on his extensive experience, trained his pilots in the art of dogfighting, teaching them to anticipate their enemies' moves and exploit their weaknesses. One key tactic was the element of surprise. By attacking from above and behind, the pilots could catch their opponents off guard, gaining the upper hand in the engagement. Coordination and communication were also crucial, as teamwork often made the difference between victory and defeat. Lieutenant Thor, known for his sharp mind and quick reflexes, excelled in these tactical maneuvers. He often led by example, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated attacks and evasive maneuvers. Under his guidance, the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille honed their skills, becoming a formidable force in the skies. As the months passed, the men of the Lafayette Escadrille faced increasing challenges. The intensity of the combat, combined with the physical and emotional strain of war, began to take its toll. Fatigue and stress were constant companions, and the loss of comrades weighed heavily on their hearts. Bert Hall, a former cowboy and soldier of fortune, struggled with the harsh realities of the war. His adventurous spirit had drawn him to the conflict, but the relentless grind of combat tested his resolve. Hall's letters home revealed his inner turmoil as he grappled with the fear and uncertainty that accompanied each mission. Despite these hardships, the pilots remained steadfast in their commitment to the cause. The bond they shared provided strength and solace, helping them to endure the rigors of war. In the face of adversity, they found the courage to continue, driven by the belief that their efforts were making a difference. In October 1916, the Lafayette Escadrille suffered a devastating blow with the loss of Norman Prince, one of its founding members. Prince had been a driving force behind the formation of the unit, his passion and dedication inspiring others to join the cause. His death in a crash landing after a successful mission was a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. The loss of Prince was felt deeply by his comrades, who mourned the passing of a friend and leader. His sacrifice underscored the high stakes of their mission, reinforcing their determination to honor his memory through their actions. The spirit of Prince lived on in the hearts of the pilots, motivating them to push forward in the face of adversity. As the war continued, the men of the Lafayette Escadrille drew strength from the legacy of their fallen comrades. The memory of Norman Prince, along with others who had given their lives, served as a powerful reminder of the importance of their mission. They vowed to carry on, inspired by the bravery and dedication of those who had come before them. The winter of 1916 brought new challenges for the Lafayette Escadrille. The cold, harsh weather made flying even more perilous, as snow and ice coated their planes and reduced visibility. The pilots had to contend with frozen engines, slippery runways, and the ever-present threat of enemy action. Despite the difficulties, the men remained committed to their mission. The camaraderie they had built over months of shared experiences helped them to endure the harsh conditions. They found solace in the warmth of the mess hall, where they gathered to share stories, play games, and bolster each other's spirits. The resilience of the Lafayette Escadrille was tested during this challenging period, but their determination never wavered. They continued to take to the skies, knowing that their efforts were crucial to the war effort. The bonds they had forged provided the strength and support needed to face the winter's chill and the battles that lay ahead. As spring of 1917 dawned, the men of the Lafayette Escadrille were beginning to feel the weight of their months in combat, the constant barrage of enemy aircraft, the unpredictability of weather, and the strain of maintaining vigilance had become routine. Though no less exhausting, yet each man carried with him a quiet sense in the skies, was crucial to the broader French war effort. On this particular day, the squadron received orders for a reconnaissance mission over the Verdun sector. The target was a critical supply line used by the German forces, vital for their ongoing operations in the region. As the men prepared for takeoff, Captain Georges Lanotte gathered the pilots for a brief, his tone somber. "We are not merely flying to gather intelligence today," Venault said, his voice cutting through the noise of engines. "We are striking at the heart of the enemy's lifeblood. If we succeed, we not only gather valuable information, but we also deny them what they need to keep fighting. The stakes are high. This will not be an easy mission." The gravity of his words hung in the air. Among the pilots there was a mixture of anticipation and quiet resolve. Lieutenant William Thaw, whose leadership had become the cornerstone of the squadron's tactics, was particularly focused. His Newport 11 gleamed in the weak sunlight, ready for action. Beside him, Raoul Lufbery, with his ever-steady demeanour, nodded. The veteran of countless dogfights was the squadron's quiet strength, a symbol of both courage and caution. The air was thick with tension as they took off. The men of the escadrille knew the risks all too well. German aircraft were always lurking in the skies, eager for any chance to engage in combat. But for them, fear had long become a distant companion, replaced by an acute awareness of the danger in every flight. The mission went smoothly at first, with the pilots flying in tight formation. But as they approached the target area, enemy aircraft appeared from the clouds like spectres, streaking towards them in a deadly dance. The dogfight that ensued was as chaotic as it was brutal. The dogfight that ensued was as chaotic as it was brutal. In the midst of the battle, James McConnell, a native of North Carolina and a former ambulance driver who had joined the escadrille out of a deep sense of duty, found himself locked in combat with a German pilot. His plane was a lean, nimble model, and McConnell was known for his daring maneuvers. But in the heat of the battle, a miscalculation led to his plane being struck. McConnell's aircraft spun uncontrollably before crashing into a forest below. His plane was a nimble model. Before crashing into the forest below, his final mission led to his own death, and his body scattered on the grave. Back at base, news of McConnell's loss was met with shock and sorrow. He had been one of the first to volunteer for the French Air Service and had proven himself a fearless and capable aviator. His death marked the first real loss for the unit, and it cast a shadow over the squadron's morale. Despite this, the rest of the men pressed on, finishing their mission and returning to base, where their victory was tempered by grief. The day after McConnell's death was one of mourning and reflection for the men of the Lafayette Escadrille. They gathered in the mess hall, where the mood was sombre. Captain Tenold, addressed the squadron, his words offering both solace and a call to continue the fight. James McConnell was not just a brave pilot. He was a man who believed in the cause we serve. His sacrifice will not be forgotten, Thenol said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. We must honor him, not by wallowing in our grief, but by ensuring that his legacy lives on in our victories. We will fight for him as we fight for France. The pilots nodded, the weight of the loss sinking in. For many, McConnell had been more than a comrade. He had been a friend. Yet, in the silence that followed, the men understood that the war did not stop for individual tragedies. The next mission was already being planned, and the call to action would soon come again. Raoul Lufbery, in particular, took McConnell's death hard. Having already seen the horrors of war, Lufbery had grown close to McConnell. The loss made him more determined than ever to keep flying, but it also deepened his reflection on the harsh realities of aerial combat. He wrote to his fiancée, asking for strength and peace of mind. I know you will worry, but please understand, I fight because I believe in this cause. I will not let James' death be in vain. I will keep flying, even when the skies feel dark, Lufbery wrote in a letter sent home. As spring turned to summer, the Lafayette Escadrille continued to grow as a unit. Their successes in the skies were matched only by their losses, and the men who survived the dogfights began to develop an unspoken bond, one forged in the fires of combat and solidified by their shared sense of purpose. The early summer months brought with them an escalation of the war's brutality. The Lafayette Escadrille was called to action more frequently, their role in protecting the French lines of defense becoming ever more crucial. The reputation in the air had been cemented, but each victory came at a personal cost. One of the most harrowing battles occurred on a particularly hot day in July 1917. The squadron had been assigned to a high-risk mission to intercept a group of German bombers targeting key French infrastructure. The plan was to engage the enemy at high altitude before they could release their payload. Captain Chenault led the squadron into the skies, and they found the German bombers just as planned. The air was thick with tension, the men knowing that the outcome of this mission could change the course of the war in the region. However, as they attacked, the bombers' escort of German fighters swarmed in, engaging the Lafayette pilots in what would become one of the fiercest dogfights of the war. Raoul Lufbery's Nieuport was quickly engaged by two Albatros fighters. He maneuvered his aircraft with remarkable agility, but one of the German planes managed to get in close, firing a deadly burst into Lufbery's wing. The damage was substantial, and Lufbery was forced to make an emergency landing. As he hit the ground, his thoughts were filled with one simple truth: the enemy was relentless, but so was he. Lufbery survived the crash, though his aircraft was beyond repair. Back at the base, he was greeted with relief by his comrades, who helped him recover from the ordeal. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Lufbery admitted to his fellow pilots that the battle had shaken him, but he refused to let it stop him from continuing the fight. "I won't give them the satisfaction of thinking they've beaten me," Lufbery remarked later that evening, his voice resolute. Aye. The days following Lafayette's crash saw the men of the Lafayette Escadrille continuing their missions, each flight a reminder of the fine line between life and death. But it was also a time of deepening bonds. The pilots had become more than just comrades. They were brothers. Their shared experiences in the sky, the victories and the losses, created a bond that transcended words. On one occasion, after a particularly brutal battle in which several pilots were forced to crash land, the squadron came together to rebuild their planes and tend to the wounded. Despite the exhaustion and constant threat of enemy fire, the men's spirits remained unbroken. The sight of each pilot working together to repair their aircraft, sharing stories of their exploits, and lending a helping hand when needed, was a testament to the windows the minds had been considering on the flight to the wind forest. Meetings at Wivinston Hall were upheld by the familiar sight. In the evenings, they often gathered around the campfire, telling stories of their lives before the war. Some spoke of families back home, others of their aspirations for the future. There was a sense of camaraderie that existed in these quiet moments, a respite from the horrors of the battlefield. Miranda bought a particular night for me when she herself had a similar experience. Victor Chapman, who had become one of the squadron's most skilled pilots, often played the role of storyteller, recounting his experiences and imparting his wisdom to the younger aviators. Despite the seriousness of his duties, Chapman's light-hearted nature helped to lift the spirits of the squadron. One night, as the men sat around the fire, Chapman spoke with a rare seriousness. He spoke the truth about both himself and the rare devil. "Men, we're more than just pilots in this war. We're symbols," he said. "We represent the strength of America, of freedom, and of what we believe in. But we must never forget the price of that freedom. We fight not just for ourselves, but for those who can't." As the fire crackled and the night drew on, the men were reminded that they were not just fighting in the skies above France, but for a cause greater than any one individual. They were united by their shared mission, their sacrifice, and the bonds they had forged in the heat of battle. The summer of 1917 was proving to be a turning point for the Lafayette Escadrille. The men had grown accustomed to the risks of aerial combat, and though their losses were heavy, their skill in the skies had become undeniable. Their reputation as a fierce and dedicated squadron reached both the French military command and the German Luftstreitkräfte, who had learned to fear the American volunteers who flew under the banner of the Lafayette Escadrille. Lieutenant Raoul Lufbery, now one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron, took it upon himself to share his tactical knowledge with the younger pilots. Lufbery had learned much in his years of combat, especially during his time in the U.S. Air Service. before joining the French. His skill was not only in combat, but also in maneuvering in the ever-changing dynamics of aerial warfare. One evening, as the pilots gathered around a map in their tent, Lufbery outlined a strategy to intercept a group of German bombers who had been terrorizing French supply lines. The bombers, heavily escorted by enemy fighters, would be formidable, but Lufbery believed they could exploit one key weakness. "We know the Germans are predictable. Their bombers fly in tight formations, relying on their escorts for protection," Lufbery said, pointing to the map. "But if we break their formation and divide their attention, we can catch them off guard. The moment their formation breaks, we take them out, one by one." The younger pilots, like Lieutenant Victor Chapman and the eager James Norman Hall, listened intently, their faces lit by the dim glow of a lantern. Chapman, known for his bravery and knack for quick decisions, was particularly eager to try Lufbery's strategy. On the mission day, the squadron took to the air with renewed determination. As they approached the German bombers, their plan unfolded as expected. The German fighters immediately launched an attack, but Lufbery's pilots stayed disciplined. They broke off in pairs, engaging the German fighters, but always remaining aware of the bombers' vulnerable positions. It was Victor Chapman who first executed the maneuver perfectly. With a swift dive, he separated a German fighter from its bomber escort. The enemy pilot, caught off guard by Chapman's attack, tried to outmaneuver the American, but Chapman's Nieuport was quicker. A burst of gunfire struck the German plane, sending it spiraling toward the earth. The dogfight that ensued was chaotic, but Lufbery's tactics proved effective. The Germans had not anticipated such a coordinated effort from the Americans, and soon their bombers were scattered, easy targets for the men of the Lafayette Escadrille. As the squadron returned to base, their mission was considered a success. The intelligence gathered was invaluable, and the disruption they caused in the German bombing raids significantly weakened the enemy's supply lines. It was a hard-fought victory, but for the men of the Escadrille, it was another example of their growing prowess in the skies. The victories that came with each successful mission could never quite erase the toll of war. For every victory in the air, the men of the Lafayette Escadrille knew that they would also face losses. By the late summer of 1917, the squadron had lost several pilots, including some of its most skilled members. Lieutenant William Thor, a former Harvard student who had become one of the most admired aviators of the squadron, was one of the latest to fall. His death hit the squadron hard. Thor had been known not only for his exceptional flying abilities, but also for his leadership and humor in the face of adversity. His loss left a void that would be hard to fill. The pilots knew the risks of combat all too well, but the loss of Thor, who had become a symbol of American bravery in the skies, was a bitter blow. Captain Georges Thénault, who had come to rely on Thor's wisdom and camaraderie, addressed the squadron after the news broke. "Thor was more than just a great pilot," Thénault said solemnly. He was a man of integrity, a man who stood by his comrades through every trial. His death is a reminder of the cost of our cause, but we must continue to fight. We fight for him, as we fight for all who have fallen. The emotional weight of Thor's death was heavy on the squadron, but the pilots carried on. They flew their missions with an even greater sense of duty, driven by the memory of their fallen comrades. Their bonds had been forged in the crucible of war, and in each mission they honored those who had been lost. One evening, after a particularly grueling mission, Bravery sat down with Chapman and a few of the other pilots. They spoke little, but their shared silence was filled with understanding. They had come to rely on each other, not just for their flying skills, but for their strength in the face of loss. In those quiet moments, they understood the true cost of war, not just the loss of life, but the erosion of innocence, the endless cycle of sacrifice. "I'll never get used to it," Chapman said, breaking the silence. "The loss, I mean. It doesn't matter how many victories we have. We always end up paying the price." He nodded toward Portray. The man was staring, and his eyes were unfocused. He looked formidable. A murmuring came from the side of the room. Bravery, his face a mask of quiet resolve, nodded. "War never gives us anything for free," he said quietly. "But we do what we can, and we remember those who've given everything for us." As the fall of 1917 approached, the situation on the front lines of World War I was shifting. The American involvement in the war had become increasingly significant, and the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille were now seen as a key asset in the French air effort. The Americans were starting to make their presence felt, and their growing prowess in the sky was matched only by their unyielding spirit. The German air forces had become more cautious, now fully aware that the Americans would fight back fiercely. The introduction of newer, more advanced aircraft by both sides meant that the balance of power was constantly in flux. The Lafayette pilots were quick to adapt, their tactical acumen matched by their resilience. One of the key moments in the autumn of 1917 came when the squadron received orders to assist in the defense of the vital city of Verdun. The Germans had launched a new offensive, and it was feared that they would attempt to break through the French defences. The escadrille was called to provide air cover for the French artillery and infantry units, ensuring that the Germans could not gain the upper hand. The mission was fraught with danger. As the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille took to the skies, they found themselves in the thick of a fierce aerial battle. The Germans were throwing everything they had into the fight, their aircraft swarming in large numbers. In the chaos of the battle, Bravery and Chapman found themselves paired together once again, their tactics honed by months of shared experience. The two pilots fought side by side, their planes weaving through the smoke and gunfire. With every burst of enemy fire, they maneuvered with an almost instinctual precision. It was a battle of attrition, with neither side willing to yield. Through it all, Bravery's calm demeanour and Chapman's quick thinking proved invaluable. By the time the mission was completed, the Lafayette Escadrille had inflicted significant damage on the German forces, forcing them to retreat. It was another hard-fought victory, but it came at a cost. Several more pilots had been lost, and the toll of the war continued to weigh heavily on the squadron. As they returned to base, the pilots were greeted with both relief and sorrow. They had succeeded, but at what price? Inside their vehicles, they felt that something must be done. "We're still here," Lufbery said quietly to Chapman as they disembarked from their planes. "And that's what counts. But it's getting harder to see the end of this war." Blank countenance, slowly rising. Chapman nodded, his face drawn from the intensity of the battle. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, Raoul," he said, "but we'll fight as long as we can. For them. For all of them." The squadron had become more than just a group of soldiers. They were a family, bound together by the shared experience of war, their fates tied to one another in ways that no one outside the squadron could ever understand. In the face of mounting casualties and the endless cycle of combat, the Lafayette Escadrille continued to fly, driven by a sense of duty and an unwavering belief in their cause. The fall of 1917 ushered in a turning point for the Lafayette Escadrille. The pilots, though seasoned and battle-hardened, were beginning to feel the wear and tear of continuous combat. Their mission, always dangerous, had begun to feel like an endless grind of dogfights and harrowing near misses. The German air forces were relentless, and each day in the skies was an exhausting test of endurance. Despite the growing pressure, the escadrille pilots, led by figures like Raoul Lufbery and Victor Chapman, carried out their duties with unwavering professionalism. Their valor on the battlefield had earned them not only the respect of their comrades, but also a place in history. The squadron had become a symbol of the French-American alliance, representing the shared fight for freedom. One of the most crucial missions during this period came in early October 1917, when the squadron was called to support the French offensive at the Battle of Passchendaele. The Germans had launched a major counter-offensive, and the stakes had never been higher. Raoul Lufbery, known for his calm and tactical genius, took charge of the operation. He led the squadron in a series of precision strikes against enemy supply lines and artillery positions, with the aim of crippling the German forces and slowing their advance. However, the aerial battle above Passchendaele would be a deadly one, with the Germans fielding some of their most experienced pilots. Victor Chapman, who had quickly become one of Lufbery's most trusted wingmen, played a pivotal role in this mission. His bravery in the face of overwhelming odds would earn him the admiration of his fellow pilots and secure his legacy as one of the escadrille's most respected members. The battle was a harrowing one. The pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille faced not only skilled enemy pilots, but also the harsh weather and the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire. As the squadron engaged the German bombers, the sky was filled with chaos, Explosions and tracer rounds lit up the horizon, and the roar of engines and machine guns filled the air. For Victor Chapman, it was a mission that would end in tragedy. After successfully downing one of the German bombers, Chapman's plane was struck by enemy fire. The impact sent his Neuborg into a violent spin, and despite his best efforts, he could not regain control. Chapman's plane crashed into the earth, and the young pilot was lost. The news of Chapman's death sent a shockwave through the squadron. He had been one of the brightest stars of the Lafayette Escadrille, and his loss was deeply felt by everyone, especially by Lufbery, who had considered him not only a fellow pilot, but a close friend. Valtteri, visibly shaken but resolute, gathered the remaining pilots and addressed them. "Sandfeld, Chapman gave everything for this cause. We owe it to him and to ourselves to carry on," Lufbery said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We fight not just for victory, but for those we've lost. That is our duty." As the year progressed into 1918, the war began to take on a new intensity. The Germans had launched their spring offensive, and the Allies were struggling to hold their ground. In the midst of this chaos, the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille received new aircraft, the Spad 13, a faster and more powerful fighter plane. The Spad 13 was a significant upgrade from the earlier models, with improved speed, firepower, and maneuverability. The men of the Lafayette Escadrille quickly adapted to their new planes, eager to take advantage of their enhanced capabilities. For Raoul Lufbery, the new aircraft was a welcome change, allowing him to extend his already impressive skill in dogfighting. However, the skies above the Western Front were becoming increasingly dangerous. The Germans had developed new tactics, and their aerial forces had grown more sophisticated. The escadrille pilots were now facing a more formidable enemy than ever before, but they were determined to stay ahead of the curve. One of the first major engagements involving the Spad 13 came in March 1918, during a fierce clash with German aircraft over the battlefield of Soissons. Lufbery and his fellow pilots took to the skies, ready to defend their positions and support the French ground troops below. The dogfight that ensued was nothing short of brutal. The Germans, flying their Fokker DVII fighters, were a worthy adversary, and the battle turned into a deadly contest of skill and willpower. Lufbery, now a seasoned veteran, took the lead in the fight, guiding his comrades that had earned him respect. As the battle raged on, Lufbery's tactical brilliance became apparent. His ability to coordinate his squadron, leading them through the chaos of aerial combat, was key to the success of the mission. They took down several enemy aircraft, and the Germans, unable to maintain their formation under the pressure, were forced to retreat. But despite their success, the cost of the battle was high. Several pilots, including some of the newer recruits, had been lost. As the squadron returned to base, Lufbery reflected on the ever-growing price of war. "We have won this battle," Lufbery said, his voice heavy with the weight of the losses. "But the war continues, and so must we." The spring of 1918 marked a pivotal moment for the Lafayette Escadrille. The unit had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled and courageous in the skies, and its members had proven time and again that they could hold their own against the best that the Germans could throw at them. However, the losses were mounting, and the toll on the men was becoming increasingly apparent. On May 19, 1918, tragedy struck when Raoul Lufbery, the legendary ace and leader of the Lafayette Escadrille, was killed in action. Lufbery had been engaged in a dogfight with several German aircraft when his Spad 13 was shot down. Despite attempts to parachute to safety, he was fatally wounded. Lufbery's death was a devastating blow to the squadron. His leadership, courage, and tactical expertise had been the backbone of the Lafayette Escadrille, and his loss left a void that would be difficult to fill. He had been a father figure to many of the younger pilots, offering guidance and support during the darkest days of the war. Lieutenant James Norman Hall, who had flown with Lufbery on many occasions, was one of the first to speak out in tribute to their fallen leader. "Raoul was not just a great pilot, he was a great man," Hall said. "He inspired us all, and his memory will live on as long as we fly." The news of Lufbery's death spread quickly, and the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille were determined to honor his memory. They vowed to continue the fight with the same bravery and dedication that he had always shown, knowing that their success in the skies would be a tribute to his legacy. The spring of 1918 marked not just the loss of Raoul Lufbery, but also the beginning of the end for the war. The German spring offensive had stalled, and the Allies were beginning to gain ground. The pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, despite their personal losses, played a crucial role in the final push that would lead to victory. The final months of the war saw a series of critical missions for the squadron. The Germans, though still formidable, were now on the defensive, and the American pilots were determined to press their advantage. The skies above the Western Front became a theatre for some of the most intense aerial combat of the entire war. As the armistice drew closer in November 1918, the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille found themselves facing an even more formidable enemy. The knowledge that this was their last chance to make a difference. With each successful mission, they brought their homeland closer to victory, but the heavy toll of the war had taken its toll on each of them. When the news of the armistice came on November 11th, 1918, there was a mixture of joy and solemnity. The war was over, but the men of the Lafayette Escadrille knew that the sacrifices they had made, the comrades they had lost, and the battles they had fought would never be forgotten. For the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, the victory was bittersweet. They had fought for freedom, for justice, and for the values that they held dear. But in the end, they had also fought for each other. Their legacy would endure, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring bond forged in the fires of war. The armistice in November 1918 was a moment of mixed emotions for the men of the Lafayette Escadrille. While the end of the war brought relief, it also left a deep sense of loss for those who had perished in the conflict. The squadron had become a family of sorts, united by a common cause, and the absence of their comrades, men like Raoul Lufbery and Victor Chapman and others, left a hole in the hearts of those who survived. In the days following the end of hostilities, the surviving pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille took part in a somber memorial service to honor their fallen comrades. The ceremony was held at a military cemetery in France, where many of the squadron's members were buried. The somberness of the occasion was palpable, as the pilots, many of whom had been through the worst of the war together, stood in silence, reflecting on the sacrifice of many and the solitude of the fallen comrades, where many of the squadron's members were buried, the solitude of the invader's state. James Norman Hall, who had flown alongside Lufbery, gave an emotional eulogy for his fallen friend. Raoul Lufbery was not just a pilot. He was a brother, a guide, and a source of strength for all of us, Paul said, his voice breaking. His courage, his leadership, and his unwavering commitment to the cause will never be forgotten. For the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, this service was more than just a chance to remember their fallen comrades. It was a reaffirmation of their bond and their shared mission. They had come together as a group of strangers, and through the trials of war they had forged a unity that would last long after the fighting had ended. After the armistice, many of the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille returned home to the United States. For some, the transition back to civilian life was a difficult one. The war had changed them in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. The memories of combat, the loss of friends, and the horrors they had witnessed were not easily forgotten. One of the first to return to America was Captain Georges Thénault, a French officer who had been a major influence on the success of the Lafayette Escadrille. Having led the unit with distinction, he was instrumental in the training and leadership of the American volunteers. Thénault, who had developed a deep bond with the men of the squadron, was one of the first to feel the weight of returning to a world that had moved on without him. For the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, the transition back to civilian life was marked by a sense of disorientation. They had been heroes in France, celebrated for their bravery and skill, but now they were just young men returning to a peacetime world that didn't quite understand the magnitude of their experience. Some, like James Norman Hall, found solace in writing. Hall, who had been an aviator and a writer, eventually went on to become a successful author, penning works that reflected his experiences in the war. His most famous works, such as High Adventure and The American in the Lafayette Escadrille, captured the essence of the squadron's experiences and preserved the legacy of the men who fought in the skies over France. Others, like Captain Thénault, continued their military careers, staying connected to the Air Force and contributing to the development of aviation in the post-war years. The Lafayette Escadrille had not only been a part of the American effort during World War I, but had also played a significant role in shaping the future of military aviation. The legacy of the Lafayette Escadrille continued to endure long after the war. The squadron had become a symbol of the courage and sacrifice of the American volunteers who had answered the call to defend freedom. Even before the United States had officially entered the war, the escadrille's heroic efforts were honored in France, where monuments were erected to commemorate their bravery. In 1928, a memorial was unveiled in Marnes-la-Coquette, a French village near Paris, where many of the pilots were buried. The monument, which bears the names of the 68 men who served in the Lafayette Escadrille, became a place of pilgrimage for the surviving veterans and their families. For them, it was a way to honor not only their fallen comrades, but also the bond that had been forged through shared sacrifice. The United States also recognized the contributions of the Lafayette Escadrille. In 1929, the American government awarded the squadron's surviving members the Distinguished Service Cross for their bravery and valor. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., and was attended by several of the surviving pilots, including James Norman Hall and others. For these men, the recognition was both humbling and bittersweet. They had fought not for medals or accolades, but for a cause they believed in: freedom and justice. Yet the acknowledgement of their efforts by both the American and French governments was a fitting tribute to the courage and sacrifices they had made during the war. By the early 1930s, the last members of the Lafayette Escadrille had begun to fade from public life. Some had returned to their civilian careers, while others continued their work in aviation. However, the squadron had become a part of history, a chapter in the story of World War I that was now closed. Almost 450 men had been murdered. For the survivors, the memories of the war remained vivid. They would meet periodically at reunions and memorial services to remember their fallen comrades and reflect on the bond they had shared. But as the years passed, those gatherings became fewer and farther between. The generation that had fought in the skies over France was slowly disappearing for their threatening repercussions. In 1937, the last surviving pilot of the Lafayette Escadrille, Captain Georges Denault, passed away. His death marked the end of an era for the squadron. The Lafayette Escadrille had been a remarkable chapter in the history of aviation and warfare, but the men who had made it legendary were now gone. Yet the legacy of their bravery, sacrifice, and camaraderie lived on. The Lafayette Escadrille would forever be remembered as a symbol of the spirit of American volunteers who had fought alongside their French allies. defying the odds and making an indelible mark on the history of World War I. Their contributions to the war effort and their sacrifices would continue to be honored for generations to come. Though the Lafayette Escadrille was disbanded after World War I, the squadron's impact on the future of aviation was profound. The American aviators who had flown in the squadron brought back with them invaluable experience that would influence the development of military aviation in the years that followed. Many of the pilots went on to play key roles in the establishment of the U.S. Air Service, the precursor to the United States Air Force. Their service in the Lafayette Escadrille helped to shape the direction of aviation, both militarily and technologically. The squadron's experiences laid the groundwork for future generations of aviators who would continue the legacy of courage and sacrifice that had defined the men of the Lafayette Escadrille. Today, the Lafayette Escadrille is remembered not only in monuments and memorials, but also in the enduring stories of the men who served in it. Their bravery in the skies over France remains a testament to the courage of those who fought in World War I, and their legacy is celebrated each year as part of the rich history of the American military and aviation. Story 2. The Battle of Palo Alto, First Clash of Armies, May 8, 1846. Dawn broke with an eerie stillness over the flat coastal plains of Texas. The dry grass ruled under a faint breeze, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder from distant skirmishes. Lieutenant George Meade, a young officer with piercing eyes, signaled the approach of Mexican troops under General Mariano Arista. Meade tightened his grip on his spyglass, scanning the approaching columns. "They're close, sir," he reported, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. Taylor, his demeanor calm yet resolute, nodded and gave the order to prepare the line of battle. Across the field, soldiers adjusted their positions. Cannons were loaded, and horses pawed at the ground, sensing the tension. Miles away, Private Antonio Aguilar of the Mexican Army marched at the rear of his regiment. He wiped the sweat from his brow and adjusted his kepi. "Palo Alto," he heard an officer say, pointing ahead. Antonio's thoughts drifted to his wife and infant son back in Monterey. "Will I see them again?" he wondered, swallowing the lump in his throat. As both armies positioned themselves, the open grasslands, a stage for what was to come, seemed to hold its breath. The first cannon shot shattered the silence, a harbinger of chaos and bloodshed to come. Captain Samuel Ringgold, known for his innovative artillery tactics, stood at the forefront of the U.S. line, directing the placement of his famed flying artillery. His unit's lightweight cannons were designed for rapid maneuverability, a stark contrast to the Mexican Army's heavier, slower guns. Ringgold's confidence was unshaken as he shouted commands over the deafening roar of cannon fire. "Steady, men! Load canister shot!" he yelled. His soldiers worked with practiced precision, and soon their fire erupted in devastating arcs. The Mexican infantry's tightly packed ranks wavered under the relentless barrage. The soldiers On the other side, General Arista paced along his line, barking orders. "Hold your ground," he commanded, though doubt crept into his mind. His strategy relied on overwhelming the Americans with superior numbers, yet the swift and deadly American artillery was wreaking havoc on his men. Nearby, Antonio Aguilar dove for cover as a shell exploded mere feet away, showering him with dirt and debris. Meanwhile, Mexican cavalry units circled, searching for an opening. Lieutenant Colonel Charles May, a daring American officer, observed their movements through a telescope. "They'll try to flank us," he muttered, spurring his horse toward Taylor to deliver the warning. The battlefield became a cacophony of screams, explosions, and the relentless drumming of musket fire. Yet, amid the chaos, camaraderie and courage emerged as men fought side by side, each one's survival dependent on the other.
Behind the lines, Dr. James E. Blake, a U.S. Army surgeon, worked tirelessly in a makeshift field hospital. "Bring him here," he shouted, as two soldiers carried a bloodied comrade on a stretcher. The soldier groaned in pain, a musket ball lodged deep in his thigh. Blake's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared to amputate.
No anesthesia, he thought grimly. The man's screams echoed through the tent as Blake worked. Blood stained his apron, and the metallic smell filled the air.
The toll of war weighed heavily on both sides, leaving medics and volunteers haunted by the faces of those they could not save. Sergeant John Gaines, a veteran of previous campaigns, led his men through the tall grass toward the front line. Each step felt heavier than the last. He glanced at the young private beside him, barely old enough to shave. "Dig with me, kid," Gaines said, offering a reassuring nod. As they reached the line, the enemy's musket balls whizzed past, thudding into the earth or finding flesh. Gaines raised his rifle, taking careful aim. "Fire!" he shouted, and his men unleashed a volley.
On the Mexican side, Lieutenant José Luis Pérez led a cavalry charge, his saber gleaming in the sunlight. "For Mexico!" he cried, urging his horse forward. The charge collided with American infantry, and chaos erupted. Perez's horse reared as a bullet struck its flank. He was thrown to the ground, narrowly avoiding a bayonet thrust as he scrambled to his feet.
As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the battlefield, both sides dug in, neither willing to concede. The first day of the Battle of Palo Alto ended in a grim stalemate, with the plains littered with the dead and dying. The survivors prepared for what the dawn would bring, each grappling with the weight of their experiences. As night fell over Palo Alto, the battlefield grew silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the distant cries of men calling for help. Fires flickered faintly as medics and soldiers tended to the injured. Lieutenant George Meade sat by a small campfire, cleaning his rifle. His hands shook, though he tried to steady them.
"First time seeing action?" a voice asked. Mia looked up to see Captain Ringgold, his face shadowed by the firelight.
"Yes, sir," Meade admitted. "It's not what I imagined." Ringgold sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "It never is. You fight for your country, your men, and you hope you make it out alive."
On the Mexican side, Antonio Aguilar lay on his back, staring at the stars above. Around him men whispered in hushed tones, sharing canteens and prayers. Ses andres vorn. He thought of his family, of the fields he once ploughed. His friend Pedro sat beside him, smoking a cigarette. Tomorrow will be worse, Pedro said to Zihra, Sigper, and his friend. Antonio nodded. If we survive it, we'll be lucky. Sleep came fitfully to both sides that night, the weight of the day pressing on their minds. Soldiers dreamed of home, of peace, while the reality of the coming battle loomed like a dark shadow on the horizon. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting a golden hue on the trampled grass of Palo Alto. General Zachary Taylor stood atop a small rise, surveying the battlefield. His face was impassive, but those who knew him well could sense the tension behind his steady demeanor. "Order the line forward," he commanded, his gravelly voice breaking the morning stillness.
Lieutenant George Meade relayed the order, his voice carrying over the din of the waking camp. Soldiers moved with purpose, their faces set with grim determination. The artillery crews adjusted their positions, readying their guns for the next phase of battle. Captain Ringgold, despite the pain in his leg, directed his men with unwavering resolve. "Aim for the cavalry," he instructed, pointing toward the Mexican lines. On the opposing side, General Arista held a council with his officers. Their ranks had thinned during the previous day's fighting, and morale was low. "We must press the attack before they regroup," Arista urged, though doubt lingered in his tone. Lieutenant Jose Luis Perez listened intently, his jaw clenched. The memory of his failed charge.
The sun crept over the horizon, its golden light illuminating the damp fields of Palo Alto. The morning dew clung to the tall grass, masking the horrors that lay beneath it. General Zachary Taylor, his broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his determined face, sat astride his horse, Old Whitey. Taylor's sharp eyes carrying a calm authority. "Steady nerves, boys," he called out to the troops, his voice carrying the calm, unhurried command of the tyro. General Zachary Taylor, his voice carrying a calm authority. "We've got work to finish."
Nearby, Captain Samuel Ringgold adjusted his saddle, despite the searing pain in his leg from yesterday's shrapnel wound. His face was pale, but his resolve remained unbroken. "Bring the artillery forward," he ordered, knowing that his lightweight cannons were key to breaking the Mexican lines. On the Mexican side, General Mariano Arista stood amidst his officers, issuing orders with a firm hand. His strategy was simple: press forward with infantry while using cavalry to flank the Americans. Antonio Aguilar, exhausted but alive, readied his musket. "We fight for Mexico," he muttered to himself, steeling his nerves. As the first volleys of cannon fire erupted, the sky turned grey with smoke, and the battlefield once again descended into chaos. As musket balls whizzed through the air, Sergeant John Gaines led his men into the fray. "Hold the line," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the effort. His men, emboldened by his courage, stood firm against the advancing Mexican infantry. Beside him, Private William Allen clutched his rifle tightly, his knuckles white.
On the other side, Lieutenant Jose Luis Perez rallied his cavalry. "Charge!" he cried, spurring his horse forward. The cavalry thundered across the field, their sabers glinting in the sun. They slammed into the American right flank, causing a temporary rupture in the line. Seeing the danger, Lieutenant Colonel Charles May led a countercharge with his dragoons. The clash of swords and the cries of men filled the air as the two cavalry units collided in a brutal melee. May's saber caught Perez's shoulder, knocking him off his horse. Dazed but alive, Perez crawled to safety, his resolve unshaken.
In the rear, Dr. James E. Blake continued his grim work in the field hospital. Next, he called, as stretcher after stretcher brought in wounded soldiers. Among them was Captain Ringgold, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "He's not going to make it," Blake whispered to a fellow surgeon. Despite their best efforts, Ringgold succumbed to his injuries later that day, leaving a somber void in the American ranks.
On the Mexican side, Doña Maria Perez moved between the injured, her hands bloodied but steady. She pressed a cloth to a soldier's chest wound, whispering words of comfort. Around her, the cries of the wounded painted a harrowing picture of war's true cost.
As the day wore on, the American artillery proved decisive. Under the command of Lieutenant Randolph Ridgely, the flying artillery moved swiftly, targeting vulnerable points in the Mexican lines. "Fire!" Ridgely shouted, and the cannons roared, sending deadly shrapnel into the advancing infantry.
General Arista's forces began to waver under the relentless bombardment. Seeing the faltering lines, Taylor ordered an advance. "Push them back," he commanded. The American infantry surged forward, bayonets gleaming, their shouts echoing across the field. Antonio Aguilar, now fighting in retreat, glanced around at the chaos. His regiment was in disarray, and survival seemed uncertain. Yet he held his ground, determined to fight until the last.
By nightfall, the Mexican army was forced to withdraw, leaving the battlefield to the Americans. The plains of Palo Alto were littered with the dead and dying, the air heavy with the scent of gunpowder and blood. The first major battle of the Mexican-American War had ended, but the conflict was far from over. As night fell on May 8, 1846, General Mariano Arista ordered a strategic retreat toward Resaca de la Palma, hoping to regroup and fortify his position. His face was etched with exhaustion and frustration, the weight of the day's losses pressing heavily on him. "We must hold the next position," he told his officers, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his confidence. The retreating Mexican soldiers, including Antonio Aguilar, trudged through the darkness, the sounds of moaning wounded and the distant clatter of artillery wheels accompanying them.
Antonio clutched his musket tightly as he marched. Around him, morale was low, the earlier pride in their mission now overshadowed by the reality of defeat. Beside him, his friend Pedro limped, his face pale from a leg wound. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Pedro asked. "No one," Pedro said.
"They will," Antonio replied grimly. He glanced back at the battlefield behind them, now swallowed by the night. "And we'll have to face them again." General Zachary Taylor, buoyed by the success at Palo Alto, wasted no time in preparing his troops to pursue the retreating Mexican army. "They're moving to Resaca de la Palma," he told his staff officers. "We can't let them recover. We press forward at first light." Lieutenant George Meade, now gaining confidence from his first taste of battle, busied himself with preparing maps and reports for the next phase of the campaign. Though the day's victory had emboldened the men, Meade felt a pang of unease. The Mexican army had proven resilient, and he knew the conflict was far from over.
Meanwhile, Sergeant John Gaines checked on his men, many of whom were still shaken from the battle. "Get some rest while you can," he said. "We'll need every ounce of strength tomorrow." He looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of campfires marked the enemy's retreat. Gaines knew the fight ahead would be just as brutal, if not worse. By May 9, the two armies faced each other once more, this time in the dense chaparral near Resaca de la Palma. The terrain offered a stark contrast to the open fields of Palo Alto. Thick underbrush and narrow pathways made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, creating an atmosphere of suffocating tension. General Arista took advantage of the natural defences, positioning his troops strategically along the ravines and thickets. "Hold this line at all costs," he commanded. His officers, including Lieutenant José Luis Perez, nodded grimly, determined to fight.
On the American side, Taylor's forces advanced cautiously. Lieutenant Colonel Charles May, known for his boldness, volunteered to lead a cavalry charge. "We'll break their artillery," he promised Taylor, gripping the reins of his horse tightly. Taylor nodded. "Be quick and decisive," he said. "We can't afford a drawn-out fight." As the sun climbed higher, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma erupted in fierce skirmishes along the tangled brush. Musket fire echoed through the thickets, and soldiers fought desperately in close quarters, often unable to see their enemies until they were within arm's reach.
Charles May's cavalry thundered forward, a line of horsemen cutting through the dense foliage. May's target was a key Mexican artillery position, commanded by General Pedro de Ampudia. The Mexican cannons had stalled the American advance, and May's mission was critical. "Forward," May shouted, leading his men into the teeth of enemy fire. The charge was chaotic, with horses and men falling under a hail of bullets. Yet May pressed on, his sabre slashing as he broke through the artillery line. His men captured several cannons, turning them on the Mexican forces. Beat out by the force of May's battle axe, he prevented the men from capturing his sabre. For Antonio Aguilar, the sight of the cavalry's relentless advance was harrowing. He fought alongside his comrades, his musket trembling in his hands. The Mexican line was faltering, and Antonio could feel the tide of the battle turning once more.
By late afternoon, the Mexican army's position was untenable. General Arista reluctantly ordered a full retreat, leaving behind artillery, supplies, and many of his wounded. The dense terrain that had initially offered protection now became a hindrance, as soldiers scrambled to escape.
On the American side, Zachary Taylor rode onto the battlefield, his calm demeanor masking the satisfaction of another victory. As the sun set over the blood-soaked ravines of Resaca de la Palma, both sides licked their wounds. For some, the day marked the beginning of a long campaign. For others, it was the end of their fight. Yet for all who survived, the memories of the battle would remain etched in their minds forever. As night fell on May 9th, 1846. The once vibrant chaparral near Resaca de la Palma lay eerily silent, save for the cries of the wounded and the faint rustling of wind through the underbrush. General Zachary Taylor's forces secured the battlefield, but the victory came at a cost. The sight of mangled bodies and abandoned artillery haunted even the most hardened soldiers.
Lieutenant George Meade walked among the remnants of the fight, his boots crunching over spent musket balls and shattered sabres. He paused beside a wounded Mexican soldier, barely conscious and clutching a blood-soaked bandage over his abdomen. Meade knelt, offering his canteen. The soldier murmured something in Spanish, too faint to understand, before losing consciousness. For Meade, the moment underscored the shared humanity of war. A lesson he would carry for years to come. On the Mexican side, General Mariano Arista's retreat across the Rio Grande marked a bitter turning point. Struggling to maintain control over his disorganized troops, Arista faced mounting criticism from his officers and subordinates. The loss of critical artillery pieces and supplies weighed heavily on him. "We were outmaneuvered," he admitted to his senior staff, though the sting of failure cut deeper than he let on. Lieutenant José Luis Perez, nursing a gash on his arm from the battle, stood silently as Arista addressed his officers. Perez admired the general's determination, but couldn't ignore the growing murmurs of dissent among the ranks. Many soldiers, including Perez, felt abandoned by poor planning and leadership. Morale was crumbling, and desertions were on the rise. For Antonio Aguilar, the retreat was a personal torment. As he waded across the Rio Grande, he couldn't stop thinking about Pedro, his closest friend, who had been left behind on the battlefield. "He's probably dead," Antonio told himself, though the thought offered little solace. Around him, soldiers trudged on in silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. Back at Fort Texas, General Taylor consolidated his forces and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. He knew the victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma were just the beginning of a protracted conflict. "We've driven them back, but they'll regroup," he said during a strategy meeting. His officers, including Meade and May, nodded in agreement. Taylor's calm yet commanding presence inspired confidence among his men. "The key is to maintain momentum," he added. "We cannot allow them the time to reorganize."
For the rank-and-file soldiers, the reprieve offered a chance to reflect and mourn. Sergeant John Gaines gathered his unit near a campfire, sharing stories of fallen comrades. "They fought bravely," he said, raising a tin cup in a solemn toast. The men sat in silence, the flickering files casting shadows on their weary faces.
Dr. James E. Blake worked late into the night, tending to the wounded. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was heavy with the weight of loss. "This is the cost of victory," he muttered, his voice tinged with bitterness. Despite his years of experience, the surgeon never grew numb to the human toll of war.
The Mexican army regrouped south of the Rio Grande, digging in and preparing for a defensive stand. General Arista, aware of his precarious position, issued orders to fortify Matamoros, a critical stronghold. "This city must not fall," he declared, rallying his officers. Though his confidence faltered in private, Arista understood the symbolic and strategic importance of holding the line.
Among the defenders, Doña Maria Pérez continued her tireless work tending to the wounded. Her determination had earned her the respect of soldiers and officers alike. "We'll need more supplies," she told a junior officer. "And pray we don't have another battle so soon." But which battle?
Meanwhile, Antonio Aguilar found himself stationed at an outpost near Matamoros. The grim spectre of the recent defeats lingered, but Antonio tried to focus on his duties. Late one night, as he stood guard, he heard the faint strumming of a guitar from a nearby campfire. The melancholy tune reminded him of home, a fleeting moment of peace amid the turmoil. With both armies regrouping, the tension along the Rio Grande grew palpable. General Taylor, bolstered by reinforcements and supplies, prepared for an offensive into Mexican territory. "We'll cross the river soon," he informed his officers during a council of war. "Their defences won't hold against a determined push." Lieutenant George Meade worked tirelessly on maps and logistical plans, his meticulous attention to detail earning Taylor's praise. Yet Meade couldn't shake the unease that came with planning an invasion. He knew the risks of overextending supply lines and the challenges of fighting on foreign soil. For Mexican soldiers, like Lieutenant Perez, the anticipation of another confrontation was both unnerving and inevitable. "They'll come," Perez told his men, "and when they do, we must stand firm." Despite his words, he knew the odds were against them. They officially served for another confrontation, without any sort of sustenance. As the two armies prepared for the next stage of the conflict, the Rio Grande became a symbolic and literal dividing line. For those on both sides, it marked the boundary between survival and sacrifice, hope and despair, victory and defeat. The stage was set for a new chapter in the unfolding war, one that would test the resolve of all who fought.
The morning of May 18, 1846, arrived with the muffled sounds of marching boots and creaking wagons. General Zachary Taylor's army stood poised to cross the Rio Grande. The waters, glinting in the early sunlight, seemed calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil the crossing signified. Taylor addressed his officers with his usual brevity. "This is just the beginning. Keep the men disciplined and prepared for resistance."
Lieutenant George Meade oversaw the construction of pontoon bridges, ensuring the army could move swiftly. His engineering skills, honed at West Point, were critical to the success of the operation. As soldiers began to cross, Meade felt a flicker of pride, but also apprehension. He had read accounts of what awaited armies who overreached in unfamiliar terrain. The little bridges that sprang from the water were easy to slip on. As soldiers began to cross, Meade managed to bring up the columns. He adopted the phrase, "to keep the body ripping back to basic survivability."
On the opposite side of the river, General Mariano Arista received word of the American movements. "They've crossed?" he asked, though he already suspected as much. Despite the defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, he remained resolute. "Prepare Matamoros for defense," he ordered, knowing his forces were outmatched in artillery and morale.
Private Antonio Aguilar stood among the hastily assembled defenders. He adjusted his rifle nervously, scanning the distant horizon where dust clouds signaled the advancing American columns. Around him, his comrades whispered prayers or sharpened their bayonets. Antonio wondered if this would be his final stand.
By the time General Taylor's forces reached the outskirts of Matamoros, the city's defences were bristling with tension. Mexican cannons were positioned along key points, and soldiers worked tirelessly to fortify the town's earthen walls. General Arista had issued strict orders: hold Matamoros at all costs. Captain Charles May, leading an advanced reconnaissance unit, observed the defences through his spyglass. Their artillery placements are strong, he reported to Taylor. But their troops look ragged. Morale is low. Taylor nodded, formulating his plan. As American cannons roared to life, the siege began in earnest. Artillery shells rained down on Matamoros, shaking the earth and sending civilians scrambling for cover. Among them was Doña Maria Perez, who worked tirelessly in an improvised hospital. The cries of the wounded filled the air as she moved from one patient to the next, her hands stained with blood. "We must keep going," she urged the other medics, her voice steady despite the chaos.
On the front lines, Antonio Aguilar fired his musket until his hands ached. Around him men fell one by one, some crying out for their mothers, others collapsing silently. "Keep firing!" shouted an officer. But Antonio's ammunition ran out. His scavenged from a fallen comrade, his mind numb to the horror surrounding him. After days of relentless bombardment, a breach in Matamoros's defences opened. General Taylor ordered an infantry assault, and the Americans advanced through the smoke-filled air. Leading the charge was Sergeant John Gaines, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Forward, men! Take the walls!"
The battle devolved into brutal close-quarters combat as American soldiers scaled the walls and engaged the defenders. Lieutenant José Luis Perez fought valiantly, wielding his saber with precision. He rallied a group of his men to counter the American advance, but their efforts were overwhelmed by the sheer force of Taylor's army.
Among the chaos, George Mee directed artillery fire to support the assault. He watched through his field glass as the American flag was raised over a key defensive position. "It's over," he muttered, though he knew the cost had been steep. A unit. As the Mexican forces retreated further into the city, Antonio Aguilar found himself separated from his unit. Wandering through the smoke and rubble, he stumbled upon a wounded American soldier clutching his side. By nightfall, the city of Matamoros had fallen. General Arista ordered a full retreat, his hopes of holding the city dashed. He escaped across the plains with what remained of his army, leaving behind artillery, supplies, and wounded men. His officers' loyalty was waning, and whispers of incompetence grew louder.
General Taylor entered Matamoros the following morning, his demeanour as steady as ever. "Secure the city," he instructed. For the American soldiers, the victory was a moment of triumph, though it was tempered by the sight of destruction and suffering.
Though the area was heavily destroyed, the surviving families recovered and saved. Dr. James E. Blake worked tirelessly in a makeshift hospital, tending to both American and Mexican wounded. "We are all the same in this," he said to a young soldier helping him. The boy nodded, though his face remained pale at the sight of so much blood.
Doña Maria Perez, now a refugee herself, sat outside the hospital, her hands folded in prayer. She had lost friends and comrades in the battle, but her resolve remained unbroken. "There will be another day," she whispered. "Oh."
For Antonio Aguilar, the fall of Matamoros marked a turning point. As he joined the retreating Mexican forces, he carried with him the weight of survival and the memory of the American soldier he had spared. The capture of Matamoros marked a significant victory for the United States, but General Taylor knew the war was far from over. "We've gained ground," he told his officers, "but Mexico will not give up easily." Lieutenant George Meade reflected on the campaign thus far. He had seen valor and tragedy in equal measure, and, though he took pride in his role, he yearned for the day the war would end. Meanwhile, General Arista faced the wrath of his superiors in Mexico City. Accused of failing to defend Matamoros, he was relieved of command and replaced by General Pedro de Ampudia. Arista's fall from grace was swift and humiliating, yet he accepted it with quiet dignity.
As both armies regrouped and prepared for the next phase of the war, the soldiers on either side braced themselves for what lay ahead. For men like Charles May, Antonio Aguilar, and Maria Perez, the conflict had become more than a matter of national pride. It was a test of endurance, faith, and the resilience of the human spirit.
The Rio Grande had been crossed, and the battle lines were redrawn. The war would rage on, its outcome uncertain, its cost incalculable. Example number 17. An unseen enemy suffering from pests.
The road away from Matamoros was littered with remnants of a defeated army. General Mariano Arista rode with what was left of his men, his face etched with fatigue. The failure to hold the city weighed heavily on his shoulders. For now, survival was paramount. Supplies were scarce, morale was shattered, and deserters dwindled his ranks.
Private Antonio Aguilar, trudging among the foot soldiers, shared in the army's exhaustion. He felt every blister, every ache, and every pang of hunger. Despite the setbacks, he resolved to march forward. "This isn't over," he whispered to himself. In Matamoros, the mood was equally tense. General Zachary Taylor established order among his troops while securing the city's resources. "Maintain discipline," Taylor warned his officers. He understood the delicate position they were in, occupying a city whose inhabitants viewed them as invaders.
Dr. James E. Blake worked tirelessly to care for wounded Mexican and American soldiers. One night, a young Mexican soldier, barely out of his teens, reached for Blake's arm. "Will I see my family again?" he murmured. Blake hesitated, knowing the truth was uncertain. "I'll do everything I can," he replied. Moments like these reminded him of the human cost of war, a cost that transcended borders and uniforms. As the summer of 1846 wore on, General Taylor's forces prepared for their next objective, Monterrey, a fortified city nestled in the Sierra Madre. Taylor knew that capturing Monterrey would mark a significant turning point in the war. The terrain, however, was treacherous. The sweltering heat, dense vegetation, and narrow mountain passes presented a formidable challenge. Captain Charles May was among those scouting ahead. His cavalry unit rode through rugged trails, encountering ambushes from Mexican guerrilla fighters. "Stay sharp," May warned his men, after narrowly escaping a volley of musket fire. He admired the determination of the Mexican fighters, even as he sought to outmaneuver them.
General Pedro de Ampudia, now commanding the Mexican forces, fortified Monterrey in preparation for the American advance. He ordered trenches dug, artillery positioned, and supply lines secured. The Americans will find no easy victory here, Ampudia declared. Among his ranks, Antonio Aguilar worked tirelessly, holding ammunition and reinforcing barricades. The city's defense was their only chance to reclaim honor. The siege of Monterrey began on September 21, 1846. Taylor's forces, divided into columns, launched a coordinated assault on the city's fortified positions. The U.S. Army faced fierce resistance as Mexican defenders utilized the city's narrow streets and rooftops to their advantage. Lieutenant George Meade's engineering expertise was critical in navigating Monterrey's defenses. He led a team tasked with dismantling Mexican barricades under heavy fire. "Keep moving," Meade shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of musket and cannon fire. A bullet grazed his arm, but he pressed on, knowing the success of the operation depended on their progress.
Inside the city, Antonio Aguilar fought alongside his comrades, firing from behind sandbags. Smoke and dust filled the air, making it difficult to see. "Hold the line!" an officer shouted, but Antonio's focus was on surviving each second. The sound of American soldiers breaching a nearby position sent chills down his spine.
Meanwhile, Captain May's cavalry swept through the outskirts, targeting supply depots and communication lines. May's daring maneuvers earned him admiration among his peers, though he privately admitted the toll it took on his men and horses. "Victory comes at a cost," he wrote in his journal that night. As the battle raged on, the fighting grew increasingly brutal. American soldiers advanced block by block, clearing houses and alleyways. Each step was met with fierce resistance from Mexican troops and civilian militias who refused to surrender their city. Doña Maria Pérez, now aiding defenders in Monterrey, found herself in the thick of the chaos. She carried water and supplies to soldiers, while tending to the wounded in makeshift shelters. "Courage, my brothers," she urged them. Her presence inspired those around her to fight on.
Sergeant John Gaines led his platoon through the maze-like streets. The walls of Monterrey seemed to close in around them, and the sound of gunfire echoed from all directions. Gaines kicked down a door, his rifle at the ready, only to find a terrified family huddled inside. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, lowering his weapon. Moments like these reminded him of the civilians caught in the crossfire.
By the third day, the Americans had secured key positions, but the cost was high. Casualties mounted on both sides, and supplies dwindled. Taylor knew he needed to force a decisive conclusion.
On September 24th, 1846, after days of relentless fighting, General Ampudia called for a truce. Exhausted and outnumbered, he negotiated terms with Heigo Namarunda. The agreement allowed the Mexican forces to withdraw with their weapons, a decision that sparked controversy among Taylor's subordinates.
As the Mexican army retreated, Antonio Aguilar walked alongside his comrades, his heart heavy with defeat. The sight of American flags raised over Monterrey was a bitter reminder of their loss. Still, he resolved to continue fighting for his homeland.
General Taylor entered the city cautiously, ensuring his men treated the civilian population with respect. "We've won the battle," he told his officers, "but the war is far from over."
Lieutenant Meade, now recovering from his wound, reflected on the campaign. For Doña María Pérez, the fall of Monterrey marked another chapter in her journey. She stayed behind to aid the city's wounded and displaced, her resilience a testament to the strength of those who endured the war's hardships.
As the dust settled over Monterrey, both sides prepared for the next stage of the conflict. The war continued to test their resolve, shaping the destinies of soldiers, medics, and civilians alike. As Monterrey settled into a tense occupation, General Zachary Taylor faced mounting pressure from Washington to maintain control while preparing for the next phase of the war. His army was stretched thin, both in manpower and supplies. The victory, while strategically important, had not delivered a crushing blow to the Mexican resistance. Lieutenant George Meade, assigned to survey the terrain for future campaigns, ventured into the outskirts of the city. Accompanied by a small detachment, he marveled at the natural beauty of the Sierra Madre Mountains, even as he remained wary of potential ambushes. "Every step we take feels like a powder keg waiting to explode," Meade wrote in a letter to his wife. Back in Monterrey, Sergeant John Gaines worked to maintain order among the troops. "Discipline is paramount," he reminded his men, who often chafed at the restrictions imposed to prevent looting or mistreatment of the local population. Gaines understood that any incident could undermine the fragile trust between the Americans and the civilians. Doña María Pérez, meanwhile, continued her humanitarian efforts. Her presence became a symbol of hope for many residents. She organized aid for displaced families, often working alongside American medics like Dr. James E. Blake. Despite the language barrier, their shared commitment to saving lives created an unspoken bond.
By early November 1846, reinforcements arrived for Taylor's army, including troops under the command of General William J. Worth. Worth, a seasoned and ambitious officer, quickly assessed the situation in Monterrey. "The city is secure, but the enemy is regrouping," he warned Taylor during a strategy meeting.
Tensions simmered between Taylor and Worth. While Taylor preferred a cautious approach, Worth advocated for an aggressive push towards Saltillo, a key city on the road to Mexico City. The two generals respected each other, but often clashed over tactics.
On the Mexican side, General Antonio López de Santa Anna had returned to power and was assembling a massive force to confront the American advance. News of Santa Anna's preparations reached Monterrey, creating unease among the U.S. forces. Antonio Aguilar, now part of the regrouping Mexican army, felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This time," he told his comrades, "we will drive them out of our land." Captain Charles May, tasked with scouting the road to Saltillo, encountered signs of Mexican resistance. Burned out supply wagons and the remains of hastily abandoned camps hinted at guerrilla activity. May knew these skirmishes were only the beginning of a larger confrontation. In late November, Taylor's army began its march towards Saltillo, a critical stronghold in northern Mexico. The journey was arduous, with soldiers enduring harsh weather and rugged terrain. Morale wavered but Taylor's steady leadership kept his men focused. Lieutenant Meade took charge of mapping the route, his meticulous work ensuring the army avoided natural hazards and potential ambushes. Every ridge and valley must be accounted for, Meade instructed his team, knowing that accuracy could mean the difference between success and disaster.
Sergeant Gaines found himself mentoring new recruits who had joined the army after Monterre. Many were eager but inexperienced. "Listen and learn," Gaines told them. "The battlefield is no place for reckless heroics."
For Antonio Aguilar, the march was a race against time. He and his fellow soldiers hurried to fortify positions around Saltillo, preparing for the inevitable clash. The presence of Santa Anna, who had taken personal command of the Mexican forces, inspired both fear and hope among his troops.
As Taylor's forces approached Saltillo, they encountered a Mexican detachment at Agua Nueva. The skirmish was brief but intense, with both sides testing each other's strength.
Captain May led a daring cavalry charge, scattering the Mexican advance guard. His audacious tactics earned him praise from his superiors, but he remained cautious. "This is just a probe," May noted. "The main force is still ahead."
Antonio Aguilar, among the retreating Mexican soldiers, felt a pang of frustration. "We're not ready," he admitted to Pedro, his closest friend in the ranks. Pedro, ever the optimist, replied, "We'll be ready when it counts."
The skirmish provided valuable intelligence for both sides. Taylor recognized that Santa Anna's forces were larger than expected, while Santa Anna gained insight into the Americans' movements and vulnerabilities. By early February 1847, Taylor's army had reached Saltillo and established defensive positions near Buena Vista, a small village south of the city. The terrain offered a strategic advantage, with narrow passes and ridges that could funnel enemy forces.
General Taylor convened his officers, including General Worth and Lieutenant Colonel Jefferson Davis, commander of the Mississippi Rifles. "This will be a fight for survival," Taylor declared. "We're outnumbered, but we hold the high ground. Use it wisely."
Meanwhile, Santa Anna finalized his plans for an all-out assault. His army, numbering over 1,500, dwarfed Taylor's force of roughly 5,000. Despite the odds, Santa Anna was determined to deliver a decisive blow. "We will crush them here," he proclaimed.
As both armies prepared for the impending battle, soldiers on both sides wrestled with their fears and hopes. For men like George Meade, John Gaines, Antonio Aguilar, and countless others, the coming days would test their resolve and shape their destinies.
The night before the battle, tension gripped both camps. General Zachary Taylor, seated under a makeshift tent, reviewed intelligence reports and maps by lantern light. His weathered face betrayed no fear, but the enormity of the situation weighed heavily. Lieutenant George Meade stood nearby, awaiting orders. "Meade, double-check the artillery placements at dawn," Taylor instructed. "If Santa Anna is coming, he'll come with everything he's got."
Meade nodded, saluting sharply before heading to his quarters. Along the way, he passed soldiers huddled around campfires, speaking in hushed tones. Many of them, he knew, would not see another sunrise. On the Mexican side, Antonio Aguilar sat with his regiment, his musket resting across his knees. Henry Santa Anna's stirring speech earlier in the day had inspired the troops, but doubt lingered in Antonio's mind. Pedro, ever optimistic, nudged him. "You heard the general? This will be the day we reclaim our land."
Antonio managed a faint smile. "Let's hope you're right." Around them, thousands of Mexican soldiers prepared for the coming battle, their faith in Santa Anna unwavering despite the logistical challenges they faced. On the morning of February 23, 1847, the sun rose over Buena Vista, illuminating the rugged terrain that would soon be drenched in blood. General Taylor, positioned at a forward command post, surveyed the battlefield through his spyglass. The terrain, a series of ridges, narrow passes and steep slopes, favoured the defenders. The detail of Santa Anna's numerical superiority posed a grave threat. Santa Anna, confident in his strategy, sent a messenger under a white flag to Taylor's camp. The message was a demand for surrender, asserting that the American forces were vastly outnumbered and defeat was inevitable. Taylor read the letter and responded with a single phrase: "General Taylor never surrenders." Shortly after, the first volleys of artillery fire erupted. Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery, stationed on elevated ground, unleashed devastating barrages on the advancing Mexican forces. "Give them a taste of what's to come," Bragg shouted as his cannons roared. Mexican infantry surged forward in disciplined waves, their brightly coloured uniforms contrasting with the grey, dusty landscape. Antonio Aguilar, near the front, braced himself as musket balls whizzed past. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp scent of gunpowder. Lieutenant Colonel Jefferson Davis, commanding the Mississippi Rifles, led his men to a key defensive position along a narrow pass. "Stand firm," Davis called out. His voice, calm yet commanding, steadied the nerves of his men. The Mexican cavalry, led by General Torrejon, charged towards the American position. The thunder of hooves grew deafening as the cavalry closed in. Davis ordered his men to hold fire until the last possible moment. "Wait for it, now," he shouted. The rifles unleashed a deadly volley, their precision fire halting the cavalry's momentum. The charge dissolved into chaos as horses and riders fell. Davis, his sword drawn, led his men in a counter-attack to secure the pass. On the Mexican side, Antonio Aguilar found himself caught in the confusion. He narrowly avoided being trampled as his regiment was pushed back. General Torrejon rallied his forces, shouting, "Reform the line. We fight on." Grafistación incomodora antaccident. As the battle raged, General Santa Anna committed his reserves in a bold attempt to overwhelm the American left flank. General Ampudia's division advanced, supported by artillery fire that shook the ground. Taylor, recognizing the danger, called for reinforcements. Captain Charles May and his cavalry were ordered to counter the Mexican advance. "Charge!" May bellowed, leading his men in a daring assault. The clash was brutal, with sabres flashing and musket fire erupting at point-blank range.
Amid the chaos, Lieutenant George Meade directed artillery fire, coordinating with Captain Bragg to target the densest concentrations of Mexican troops. "Steady, men! Aim true!" Meade shouted, his voice cutting through the din.
The Mexican assault faltered under the combined pressure of American artillery and infantry. Despite their courage, the Mexican soldiers were forced to retreat, leaving the battlefield littered with the fallen. As dusk approached, Santa Anna launched one final desperate attack on the American center. This time, he led the charge personally, his presence galvanizing his troops. "For Mexico!" he cried, his voice carrying across the battlefield. General Taylor, aware of the stakes, rode to the front to inspire his men. Accompanied by his trusted horse, Old Whitey, Taylor's calm demeanor steadied the wavering lines. "Hold your ground, boys," he urged. "This is where we make our stand." Sergeant John Gaines, stationed near the center, rallied his unit. "Don't give an inch," he shouted, firing his rifle as the enemy closed in. Around him, soldiers fought with bayonets and rifles, their resolve tested to the limit. Antonio Aguilar, fighting in Santa Anna's charge, found himself face to face with an American soldier. The two locked eyes for a brief moment before engaging in a desperate struggle. Antonio's musket jammed, forcing him to use it as a club. The encounter ended with both men collapsing from exhaustion, unable to continue.
The cold wind of the Mexican highlands cut through the battered remnants of Santa Anna's army as they retreated southward. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, his ornate uniform now dirtied and torn, rode at the rear of the column, his face hardened by the weight of failure. Around him, soldiers shuffled in silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. Tone Aguilar limped alongside his comrades, the weight of his musket almost unbearable. His mind drifted to the chaotic melee of the previous day, the faces of fallen friends flashing before him. Pedro, his closest companion, was gone, lost in the final charge that had ended in disaster. Santa Anna ordered a halt, addressing his officers. "We will not let this defeat define us. Regroup the men. There is still a war to fight." His voice carried determination, but even his most loyal officers knew the truth. The loss at Buena Vista had dealt a significant blow to Mexico's war effort.
At the American encampment, the mood was somber, despite the victory. The price of holding the line at Buena Vista had been high. General Zachary Taylor walked among the wounded, offering words of encouragement. His presence brought a measure of solace to the men, but the general himself carried the burden of those lost under his command. Lieutenant George Meade sat by a campfire, writing a letter to his family. He paused frequently, his thoughts clouded by images of the battlefield. "Victory feels hollow," he wrote. "So many good men are gone." Nearby, Captain Braxton Bragg worked tirelessly with his artillerymen, ensuring the cannons were ready for the next engagement. Nearby, Captain Braxton Bragg worked tirelessly with his artillerymen, ensuring the war was far from finished. Sergeant John Gaines, his uniform stained with blood and dirt, helped bury the dead. "They fought well," he said softly, placing a marker over a grave. "Both sides did." Around him, the survivors exchanged stories of bravery and loss, finding comfort in shared memories. News of the Battle of Buena Vista reached Washington, D.C. and Mexico City within weeks, sparking reactions that would shape the course of the war. In the United States, the victory bolstered support for the war effort and cemented Zachary Taylor's status as a national hero. Politicians speculated about his potential as a future presidential candidate, a prospect Taylor himself met with ambivalence. In Mexico, the defeat deepened divisions within the government. Santa Anna faced criticism from political rivals who questioned his leadership, yet he remained determined, leveraging his charisma to rally support for the next phase of the war. "This is a setback, not the end," he proclaimed in his speech to his troops, though the strain in his voice betrayed his doubts. Back in the United States, the families of soldiers anxiously awaited letters from the front. In Pennsylvania, Mary Mead clutched a letter from her son George, her hands trembling as she read his words. "I am safe, though my heart is heavy with the weight of what we have endured. Pray for us, for the road ahead is uncertain." In Mexico, Antonio Aguilar's wife, Elena, held their infant son as she read a letter smuggled from the battlefield. "I am alive, though I have seen horrors I cannot describe. Tell our son I fight for his future." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered a prayer for Antonio's safe return. The correspondence between soldiers and their families provided glimpses of hope and connection, bridging the distance created by the war. With the immediate threat of Santa Anna's forces diminished, General Taylor received orders to hold his position and await reinforcements. The American army, though victorious, was in no condition to launch a pursuit. Lieutenant George Meade oversaw the distribution of rations, ensuring the men had enough to sustain them during the grueling days ahead. Supplies were scarce, and tempers often flared. Meade's calm demeanor and organizational skills earned him the respect of his peers. On the Mexican side, the retreating army faced even greater challenges. Hunger and disease took their toll as the soldiers marched through harsh terrain. Antonio Aguilar, determined to survive, shared his meager rations with younger soldiers. "We must keep moving," he urged, though his own strength was waning. Amid the suffering, moments of humanity and resilience emerged. In a small Mexican village, Doña Maria Perez, a civilian volunteer, offered food and shelter to passing soldiers. Her kindness provided a brief respite for Antonio Aguilar and his comrades, who were deeply moved by her passionate sorrow and passionate sympathy. In the American camp, Dr. James E. Blake continued his tireless work, treating the wounded with whatever supplies he could scavenge. His efforts saved countless lives, earning him the gratitude of soldiers and officers alike. As both armies regrouped and prepared for the next phase of the war, the soldiers found solace in the kindness of strangers and the enduring bonds forged on the General Taylor's forces, though triumphant, began the arduous task of rebuilding after the Battle of Buena Vista. The army's camp was transformed into a hive of activity as engineers, led by Lieutenant George Meade, worked to fortify positions in preparation for future engagements. Meade found himself immersed in his work, surveying the rugged terrain and devising defensive strategies. "If they come again," he remarked to a fellow officer, "we'll be ready." His growing reputation as a meticulous planner and calm presence in the face of adversity earned him the respect of his peers. Meanwhile, Captain Braxton Bragg oversaw the maintenance of his artillery. He and his men meticulously cleaned the cannons and prepared ammunition, knowing that their firepower had played a pivotal role in securing victory. "We might have won this round," Bragg told his men, "but the war isn't over." As Santa Anna's forces retreated southward, the Mexican soldiers faced grueling conditions. Antonio Aguilar marched silently, his boots worn and his stomach aching with hunger. The camaraderie of his comrades provided small comfort, but the losses weighed heavily on him. One evening, as the army camped near a dry riverbed, Aguilar shared a small meal with a group of younger soldiers. "We fight not just for ourselves, but for the honor of our country," he told them. His words, though simple, reignited a spark of hope among the weary men. Egler decided, for Santa Anna, the retreat was a bitter reminder of his tenuous position. His officers debated their next move, some advocating for a renewed offensive, while others urged caution. "We cannot let one battle decide the war," Santa Anna declared, rallying his officers with a mixture of determination and defiance. As news of the war spread, the political implications reverberated across both nations. In Washington, President James K. Polk praised General Taylor's leadership, but also began shifting focus to other theaters of the war, particularly General Winfield Scott's planned invasion of Veracruz. Taylor, while appreciating of the recognition, grew wary of the political maneuvering. In Mexico City, the defeat at Buena Vista became a rallying cry for resistance. Santa Anna's political allies worked to frame the battle as a temporary setback, emphasizing the bravery of Mexican troops and the need for continued unity. Newspapers printed stirring accounts of the soldiers' valor, bolstering public support for the war effort. Back in Texas, field hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded from both sides. Dr. James E. Blake worked tirelessly to treat American soldiers, his expertise saving many lives. Yet he was haunted by the faces of those he could not save. Among the wounded was Sergeant John Gaines, who had sustained a musket ball to the arm. Blake performed a delicate surgery to remove the projectile, telling Gaines, "You're lucky, it missed the bone. Gaines nodded weakly, grateful for the chance to return home, though he wondered if he would ever see the battlefield again. On the Mexican side, Doña Maria Perez continued her work, tending to injured soldiers in a makeshift hospital. Her efforts became a symbol of the resilience and compassion of the Mexican people, inspiring others to contribute to the war effort. USA Department of Medicine. As soldiers recovered and prepared for their next assignments, letters became a vital connection to home. Lieutenant Meade wrote frequently to his wife, describing the challenges of leadership and the toll of war. "Each day tests our resolve," he wrote, "but I find strength in the thought of returning to you." Antonio Aguilar, too, managed to send a letter to his wife, Elena. "I think of you and our son with every step," he wrote. "Your love is my anchor in this storm." The letters provided a lifeline, offering moments of solace amid the chaos. As General Winfield Scott assembled forces for an amphibious assault on Veracruz, General Taylor's role in the broader war began to shift. Orders arrived instructing Taylor to remain defensive, a move that frustrated the general, who felt sidelined despite his victories. Captain Bragg, ever loyal to Taylor, voiced his discontent. "They don't realize what you've accomplished, sir," he told the general. Taylor, however, maintained his composure. "It's not for us to question," he replied. "We'll do our duty as we always have." Meanwhile, Santa Anna began regrouping his forces near Cerro Gordo, preparing for a confrontation with Scott. His focus shifted from Taylor's army to defending the heart of Mexico, signaling a new phase of the conflict. The focus of the war shifted southward, and while General Taylor's army held their position near the Rio Grande, preparations for General Winfield Scott's campaign advanced. In early March 1847, Scott led a new phase in the war, marking a new phase in the war. News of the operation reached Taylor's camp, where frustration simmered among his officers. Lieutenant George Meade, now an experienced field engineer, discussed the developments with Captain Braxton Bragg. "They're concentrating everything on Veracruz," Meade observed, "as if the North no longer matters." "Let them," Bragg replied, ever the pragmatist. "Taylor has proven he can handle whatever comes his way. Scott will have his moment, but we've held the line where it mattered most." Despite the lull in combat for Taylor's forces, the Mexican army under General Santa Anna prepared to make a stand at Cerro Gordo, determined to halt the American advance with its mighty horses and the courageous men who rode them. On April 17, 1847, Santa Anna's forces fortified their position at Cerro Gordo, a natural choke point along the route to Mexico City. The steep hills and dense vegetation provided a strong defensive position, but morale was fragile. Antonio Aguilar, now a seasoned soldier, helped dig trenches and reinforce fortifications. He overheard officers discussing the odds of holding off Scott's forces. "We have the high ground," one officer argued. But they have artillery and engineers, another countered. Antonio kept his head down, focusing on the task at hand. His thoughts wandered to his family, but he shook them away. "Focus," he muttered to himself. "Focus. Very, very slowly." Meanwhile, General Scott's army approached with precision and discipline. Lieutenant Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, a young engineer in Scott's army, surveyed the terrain and proposed a daring flanking maneuver. "The main road is too heavily defended," Beauregard explained to Scott. "We can carve a path through the brush and take them by surprise." Scott nodded, impressed by the plan. "Do it," he ordered. On April 18th, 1847, the Battle of Cerro Gordo erupted with ferocity. Scott's forces, using Beauregard's flanking path, overwhelmed Santa Anna's defensive lines. The Mexican army fought valiantly, but struggled to hold their positions against the relentless assault. Antonio Aguilar found himself in the thick of the fighting, his rifle trembling in his hands. He fired at the advancing Americans, but the sheer volume of enemy troops was overwhelming. When the line finally broke, Antonio and his comrades retreated in disarray, pursued by American infantry. Lieutenant Beauregard, leading a group of engineers, watched as Santa Anna's personal carriage was captured. Inside, soldiers found supplies, correspondence, and even Santa Anna's prosthetic leg, a moment that would later become a symbol of the Mexican leader's humiliation. "I wish all our families and friends, everyone can take a happy holiday." By the end of the day, the Mexican army was in full retreat, and Scott's forces pressed onward toward Mexico City. As Scott advanced deeper into Mexico, Taylor's army remained stationed in northern Mexico, maintaining order in the occupied territories. The monotony of garrison duty wore on the men, but Taylor's leadership kept them disciplined. Lieutenant Meade continued his work as an engineer, fortifying positions and mapping the terrain. In his spare moments, he sketched the landscapes around him, a hobby that provided solace amid the tension. Captain Bragg, meanwhile, drilled his artillerymen relentlessly. "We may be out of the main fight now," he told his men, "but that doesn't mean we can let our guard down." For Antonio Aguilar, the retreat from Cerro Gordo was a devastating blow. He and his unit regrouped near Puebla, where Santa Anna attempted to rebuild his shattered forces. Antonio wondered how much longer the war could drag on, and whether Mexico had any hope of victory. As Scott's army approached Puebla, the city's defenders prepared for a desperate stand. Civilians joined the effort, constructing barricades and stockpiling supplies. Among them was Doña Maria Perez, who once again took up her role as a volunteer medic. "I cannot stand by while my country suffers," Maria declared, organizing a group of women to provide aid to the soldiers. Her efforts became a source of inspiration, and she was lauded by both civilians and soldiers for her unwavering dedication. Scott's forces surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and bombarding its defences. Lieutenant Beauregard, now gaining a reputation as a brilliant strategist, supervised the placement of artillery batteries. The siege was brutal, and the city's defenders endured weeks of starvation and constant bombardment. When Puebla finally fell, the road to Mexico City lay open, and Scott prepared for the final phase of the campaign. As Scott's forces advanced toward Mexico City, tensions arose within the Mexican army. Santa Anna's leadership came under scrutiny, and political divisions threatened to undermine the war effort. Antonio Aguilar witnessed heated arguments among officers over strategy. "We cannot win with Santa Anna," one officer declared. "His defeats have cost us too much." The defeats of Santa Anna have cost us too much. Despite the infighting, Antonio remained loyal to his comrades. He focused on his duties, knowing that survival depended on unity, even as the larger political landscape grew increasingly fractured. For the American forces, the march toward Mexico City was fraught with challenges. Disease ravaged the ranks, and the rugged terrain tested the soldiers' endurance. Yet the promise of victory kept them moving forward. By September 1847, General Winfield Scott's forces neared the gates of Mexico City, the final bastion of Mexican resistance. The journey had been marked by relentless battles, including the brutal encounters at Contreras and Churubusco. Both sides had endured staggering losses, yet Scott's disciplined army pressed forward. Antonio Aguilar, now stationed at the fortress of Chapultepec, stood among the defenders as they prepared for what many believed would be the final battle. He gazed at the city behind him, knowing that the hopes of an entire nation rested on their shoulders. Near him, the young cadets of the Mexican Military Academy, Los Niños Heroes, stood ready, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. On the American side, Lieutenant George Meade worked tirelessly to position artillery batteries. Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery, renowned for its precision, played a pivotal role in the preparations. Scott's orders were clear: take Chapultepec, and the city would fall. On September 13th, 1847, the assault on Chapultepec began. Cannons thundered as American forces bombarded the fortress, reducing its walls to rubble. Amid the chaos, Antonio Aguilar fired his rifle until his ammunition ran out. He grabbed a sword from a fallen officer and joined a desperate counterattack, knowing it was a losing battle. Inside the fortress, the cadets of Los Niños Heroes fought bravely, refusing to surrender. According to legend, one of them, Juan Iscutia, wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leapt to his death to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The story would become a powerful symbol of Mexican resistance and sacrifice. By the end of the day, Chapultepec was in American hands. Antonio Aguilar was among the wounded, his fate uncertain as the remnants of the Mexican army retreated. With the fall of Chapultepec, Scott's forces entered Mexico City, the once vibrant capital was eerily quiet as American soldiers marched through its streets. Despite their victory, many felt unease about the occupation. Lieutenant Meade, surveying the city, wrote in his journal, "This is not a triumph to celebrate. It is a reminder of the cost of war." Doña Maria Perez, now tending to the wounded in a makeshift hospital, witnessed the aftermath firsthand. "So much loss," she murmured, her hands trembling as she cleaned a soldier's wounds. Yet even in the face of despair, she refused to give up, believing that healing would pave the way for a better future. Santa Anna, disgraced and politically weakened, fled the city. The Mexican government, fractured and desperate, sought terms for peace. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February the 10th, 1848, officially ended the war. Mexico ceded a vast portion of its northern territory to the United States, a loss that would shape the nation's history for generations. The war had cost thousands of lives and left deep scars on both sides. Antonio Aguilar, recovering from his injuries, returned to Monterrey. He found his home intact, but the war had changed him irrevocably. He struggled to reconcile his pride in defending his homeland with the bitterness of defeat. But he died. Lieutenant George Meade, promoted for his service, reflected on his experiences as he returned home. The war had forged his skills as a leader and an engineer, lessons that would serve him in the years to come. Doña Maria Perez remained in Mexico City, dedicating her life to helping rebuild the shattered communities. Her resilience and compassion inspired those around her, a beacon of hope in the aftermath of war. Doña Maria Perez remained in Mexico City, and after the war, witnessed some. The Mexican-American War was over, but its legacy endured. For the United States, it marked a significant expansion of territory, but also deepened divisions over slavery and territorial governance. For Mexico, it was a humbling defeat that spurred a period of reflection and eventual reform. The lives of those who fought in the war, soldiers, medics, and civilians, served as a testament to the human capacity for resilience and perseverance. Antonio Aguilar found solace in his family, working the land and passing on the stories of courage he had witnessed when the war was still too semi-determined to end poison. George Meade's career continued to ascend, leading him to prominence during the Civil War, where he commanded Union forces at the Battle of Gettysburg. His experiences in Mexico had prepared him for the challenges ahead. Doña Maria Perez became a symbol of healing and hope, her name remembered in the communities she helped rebuild. Story 3. Trench Life. Stories from the front lines. The war had begun, but for now there was only the muddy, quiet expanse of the front lines. In the weeks leading up to the Great War, soldiers from the United Kingdom, France, and Germany had little idea what was to come. The seemingly peaceful landscape that stretched across Belgium and northern France would soon become a hellscape of mud, barbed wire, and devastation as the war's early battles raged on, the prospect of trench warfare would soon become a harsh reality. In the months of following it, the confusion, the poverty, the loss of life, and the devastation, grace would soon become a horror to the eye, and the mind could not suppress a shiver of terror. For prisoners wiped into ecstasy in the muddy ground. Private Henry Harry Miller of the British Expeditionary Force could never have prepared for what he would encounter. Standing among a group of soldiers in a damp trench near Ypres, Miller gazed at the sky as the sounds of distant artillery fire echoed across the fields, until he remembered the noise of the cannons, the screams of men, and the promise of more to come. Miller had joined the army months earlier, young and idealistic, with dreams of heroism. He had little experience of war, only the horror stories passed along by men who had already seen the bloody conflict unfold in Europe. But nothing could have prepared him for the suffocating fear and cold terror that gripped him as he huddled in the mud, waiting for orders. When he reached the army, in the trenches, there was no escape from the constant threat of death. A soldier's life was a long cycle of waiting, hoping to survive until the next order to attack, followed by moments of intense action. No one knew when or where the next attack would come. For now, the men sat in silence, their thoughts a mixture of dread, impatience, and uncertainty. The Battle of the Somme, the name itself, would become synonymous with the brutality of trench warfare. For Henry Miller and countless others, the opening salvo of this battle would mark the end of any innocence they might have had about the nature of modern warfare. On July 1, 1916, British forces launched a massive offensive against German positions. Harry Miller's unit was part of the first wave, and they had no idea what awaited them. The orders were simple: push forward, break the German line, and gain ground. They would advance behind a heavy artillery barrage, which was supposed to obliterate the enemy's defences. But the reality was far different. As the whistle blew, the soldiers clambered over the top of the trench, fully aware of the risks they were about to take. The open fields in front of them were littered with craters and broken terrain, a testament to the months of bombardment that had already turned the area into a wasteland. Miller and his comrades sprinted forward, bullets whizzing by their heads, the sounds of explosions deafening in their ears. Miller and his comrades sprinted forward, bullets whizzing by their heads, but the promised breakthrough never came. The Germans were entrenched, and their machine guns cut down wave after wave of British infantry. Miller's heart raced as he dove into a shell crater for cover, his comrades falling around him. The image of men, faceless and silent, gunned down in the open, would be etched in his mind forever. The battle that began with such high hopes turned into one of the bloodiest days in British military history. By the end of the first day, the British had suffered more than 5,7,0,0,0 casualties, and the offensive had barely begun. Miller barely survived, saved only by luck. and the protection of the craters, but the wounds of the day were deep, and the psychological toll of that first battle would haunt him for years. The horror of the Battle of the Somme, although a turning point in the war, was only the beginning of the long, slow grind of trench life. Henry Miller, now back in the relative safety of the trenches, found himself struggling with the day-to-day grind of surviving in the front lines. The trenches were far from the romanticized idea of battle. The men lived in constant fear of sniper fire, artillery shelling, and gas attacks. The trenches themselves were often a filthy, disease-ridden mess. The ground was a sea of mud, with standing water pooling in the bottom of each trench. Rats and lice became constant companions. Soldiers had to endure the smell of decaying bodies, rotting food, and the stench of physic colour and excrement. Yet, amidst all of this, camaraderie emerged as a powerful force. The soldiers leaned on each other for support, forming bonds forged in fire. Miller found solace in the friendships he had made, sharing stories of home with men from across Britain, and finding comfort in the small routines that provided a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. The Germans too had their own trenches, and the soldiers there were no less tired or hungry. Yet, despite the animosity of war, there were moments of eerie calm. The front lines were sometimes so close that both sides could hear each other speaking. A truce might be called to recover the dead or to exchange cigarettes. Despite their hatred, the soldiers were often more alike than they were different. Both sides were trapped in a nightmarish world that they could not escape. The stress of trench warfare took a heavy toll on the soldiers, many of whom struggled to cope with the constant threat of death and the horrors they witnessed. Henry Miller found himself growing numb to the violence and death around him. But this was not without consequences. Soldiers like Miller, who had survived the first year of the war, began to experience the effects of what would later be called shell shock, a psychological condition caused by the trauma of battle. Miller would often find himself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The sounds of battle, the whistle of shells, the screams of dying men, would echo in his ears long after the fighting had stopped. He struggled with feelings of isolation, unable to express his pain to anyone. His comrades, too, were silent, each one pretending not to hear. Exile from the front would leave him feeling alone. The comrades would leave him feeling alone. His comrades still living his life in the camps. Some men had a harder time than others. Private Thomas Richardson, a fellow soldier in Miller's unit, became increasingly withdrawn. He would often sit in a corner of the trench, staring blankly at the ground, unable to focus or respond to the calls of his comrades. One day, after a particularly violent shelling, he simply snapped. His friends had to restrain him, and he was later sent to the rear, never to be seen again. He was one of many soldiers who would never recover from the mental wounds of war. In the trenches, there was no escape from the constant barrage of stimuli that wore down the mind. Explosions, gunfire, and the relentless sounds of men fighting for their lives. For some, survival became an endless cycle of trauma as they tried to navigate the hellish landscape of war, even as it tore apart their sense of self. As the months passed, Henry Miller's sense of time became distorted. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with each one indistinguishable from the last. Life in the trenches had become a grim routine. Every day began with the same fear and uncertainty, and each night ended in exhaustion, the knowledge that another day of fighting awaited. The soldiers had few luxuries in the trenches. They lived on meagre rations, often eating stale bread, tinned meat, and the occasional slice of cheese. The men longed for the comforts of home, and when they wrote letters to their families, they often exaggerated the condition of their health, eager to reassure their loved ones. But these letters were few and far between, and many soldiers, like Miller, found it harder and harder to write home. There was nothing to say. The noise of battle continued, with constant artillery bombardments and the occasional charge across the muddy battlefield. The hope for a breakthrough, for a decisive victory that would end the war, seemed more distant with each passing day. The men continued to fight, not for glory or honor, but simply to survive. Every step forward felt like a victory, but each step came with a heavy price being put on our lives, the noise of battle, the noise of battle, the noise of battle. In the summer of 1917, the British launched the Battle of Passchendaele, one of the most infamous campaigns of the war. It was a battle marked by rain, mud, and attrition. For Henry Miller and his comrades, it was yet another brutal test of endurance. The offensive, which began in July, was meant to capture the German-held village of Passchendaele and push further into Belgian territory. However, the weather turned against the soldiers. Torrential rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud, slowing the advance and making it nearly impossible to move without getting stuck. Despite the horrific conditions, the British continued their assault. Miller's unit advanced through the waist-deep mud, their movements slow and laboured. The constant rain made it difficult to keep their weapons clean and dry, and the constant threat of gas attacks loomed overhead. The battle raged on for months, with little to show for the countryside. In the end, the British captured Passchendaele, but the cost was staggering, over 300 casualties. The loss of life, both British and German, was staggering. The soldiers who survived the battle, like Miller, were left with nothing but the memory of the endless mud, the screams of the wounded, and the sense of hopelessness that had pervaded the entire campaign. For Henry Miller, the war had become a part of his identity. He was no longer the young, idealistic man who had joined the army. He had been shaped by the violence and loss of the battlefield, and the war had taken a toll on his body and mind. Yet he pressed on, driven by the camaraderie of his comrades and the will to survive. But as the months stretched into years, Miller and the other soldiers began to question the purpose of it all. The war had become a war of attrition, with no end in sight. The constant fighting, the constant loss, seemed pointless. And yet they fought on, day after day, hoping that the end would come soon. It was a crisp morning in the winter of 1917 when the gas attack hit. The stillness of the trenches was shattered by the unmistakable hiss of poison gas, the acrid smell of chlorine filling the air. Soldiers like Henry Miller had been trained to recognize the signs of an attack, but nothing could have prepared them for the suffocating panic that gripped them as they scrambled to put on their gas masks. Miller's heart raced as he fumbled with the straps of his mask, the reality of the situation sinking in. The gas attacks, a new weapon of war introduced by the Germans, had become a terrifying part of life in the trenches. The first wave of soldiers who failed to don their masks in time were the ones who suffered the most. The poison gas caused burns to the skin, blurred vision, and, in severe cases, suffocation. As the gas enveloped the trench, Miller and his comrades crouched low, trying to shield themselves from the deadly cloud. Among the chaos, Miller saw Private Thomas Richardson, the man who had suffered from shell shock, now struggling with the mask. The mask wasn't working properly, and Richardson's panic seemed to worsen. He was stumbling, gasping, his body racked with violent coughs. Within moments, the gas took its toll, and Richardson fell to the ground, convulsing in the mud. He was one of the fortunate few who would be sent to the rear to recover, but Miller knew that many men didn't survive these attacks. The gas lingered in the trenches long after the initial assault, and the soldiers had to endure the choking smell and the fear of more attacks. It was yet another reminder of the brutality of modern warfare, where a single weapon could wipe out entire squads in a matter of seconds. The year 1917 was a pivotal one in the war. While the fighting on the Western Front remained brutal and unyielding, new technologies were beginning to change the nature of battle. Among these was the tank, a monstrous machine of war that would go on to revolutionize the way battles were fought. In November 1917, the British launched the Battle of Cambrai, a bold attempt to break the stalemate on the Western Front. The battle marked the first large-scale use of tanks in warfare. For Henry Miller and his comrades, it was both a terrifying and exhilarating moment. Tanks were unlike anything they had seen before. Armoured giants that rumbled across the battlefield, firing shells and mowing down anything in their path. Miller's unit was tasked with advancing behind the tanks, providing infantry support as the tanks pushed forward. The initial success of the attack was shocking. Miller and the other soldiers saw the German defences crumble in the face of the new weapon. But the success was short-lived. The Germans quickly adapted, and the battle devolved into a bloody stalemate once again. Miller found himself caught between the tanks and the advancing German forces, a deadly game of cat and mouse. Despite the technological advances, the human cost of war remained high. The tanks, although formidable, were slow and vulnerable. Many of them were destroyed by German artillery, and the infantry soldiers who followed had to fight for every inch of ground. By the end of the battle, the British had gained some ground, but the casualties were high, and the breakthrough was not as significant as hoped. For Miller and the others, it was another reminder of the cost of war. The tanks had promised a new way of fighting, but the old horrors of trench warfare remained. The battle was a brief glimpse of hope, but it was not the victory they had dreamed of. The holidays came and went in the trenches, each year more difficult than the last. Christmas, once a time of joy and celebration, now felt like another cruel reminder of the men's isolation and suffering. In 1917, Henry Miller found himself once again in the mud, surrounded by the sounds of distant artillery and the constant threat of enemy attack. But on this particular Christmas, something unusual happened. Amid the endless bloodshed and destruction, an unexpected truce was called. For a brief moment, the men on both sides of the trenches put down their weapons and exchanged small gestures of goodwill. The unofficial ceasefire was a rare and fleeting moment of humanity in the midst of the carnage. Miller was part of the British forces near the village of Messines, where both sides were entrenched in their positions. On Christmas Eve, soldiers from both sides cautiously emerged from their trenches. The Germans lit candles, and the British soldiers sang carols in response. For a brief moment, the war seemed to fade away, replaced by the warmth of shared humanity. Miller joined his comrades in exchanging small gifts with the German soldiers: cigarettes, food, and even buttons from their uniforms. It was a surreal experience, one that would forever remain in his memory. The men were able to speak briefly, but the common language of war, fear, hardship, and loss was the only language they truly shared. As the truce ended and the soldiers returned to their respective trenches, there was a brief, almost unspoken understanding. The war would go on, but for a moment they were just men, no different from one another. By 1918, the tide of the war had begun to shift. The United States had entered the conflict, and their support brought fresh energy to the Allied forces. The Germans, exhausted and demoralized, were struggling to maintain their hold on the Western Front. The war was drawing to a close, but for the soldiers, like Henry Miller, the end could not come soon enough. The Allied forces launched a series of offensives, pushing the Germans back and reclaiming lost territory. Miller and his comrades, though weary and battle-hardened, were determined to press forward. The last days of the war were among the most brutal, with fierce fighting taking place on the Western Front. In June 1944, in the spring of 1918, Miller's unit was involved in the final push toward the German lines. The soldiers had grown used to the rhythm of battle, the endless hours of waiting, followed by moments of intense violence. The war had become a part of them, shaping their identities and their very way of life. There was no going back to the way things were before the war. As the Allies advanced, the Germans were forced to retreat, leaving behind their positions and weapons. For Henry Miller, it was a bittersweet victory. The soldiers had fought hard, but the cost had been immense. They had lost friends, seen horrors they would not explain, and had been changed in ways they could not explain. The final days of the war were filled with anticipation. The Allies and the Central Powers had been negotiating an armistice, and it was clear that the war was nearing its end. On November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour, the armistice was silent, bringing an end to the fighting. The guns fell silent. For Henry Miller and his comrades, the news was a mixture of relief and disbelief. The war, which had consumed so much of their lives, was finally over. But the peace was not an immediate relief. The soldiers had seen too much to simply forget it all. They had lost friends, they had seen their comrades wounded and killed, and they had witnessed the terrible cost of modern warfare. The soldiers had seen too much to simply forget it all. In the days that followed, the soldiers began to return to their homes, to the families they had left behind. For Miller, it was a time of reflection. He had survived the war, but the war had changed him. It had changed them all. The end of the war did not mark the end of the trauma the soldiers carried with them. The memories of the trenches, the battles, and the loss would remain with them for the rest of their lives. But as they returned home, they carried with them a sense of resilience and camaraderie, knowing that they had survived one of the greatest conflicts in human history. The world had been forever altered by the war. The physical scars of the conflict were visible everywhere, from the shattered landscapes of Europe to the men who returned home, their bodies and minds scarred by the horrors they had endured. For Henry Miller, the war had been a part of his life, but it was not the life he had once imagined. As he returned to his family, he found it difficult to adjust. The world seemed so different from the one he had left behind. The streets were quieter, the sounds of battle replaced by the hum of everyday life. But the memories of the trenches lingered, haunting him and the men who had fought beside him. The war had ended, but for Miller and countless others, the fight was far from over. The scars of war were not just physical, they were mental and emotional, and they would last a lifetime. The war had ended, but the transition from the front lines to civilian life was not as seamless as Henry Miller had hoped. He had returned to England in December 1918, and yet the streets felt alien to him. The noise of horse-drawn carriages, the everyday chatter, and the simple act of walking without fear of an incoming artillery shell were all things that felt foreign. For Miller and the other men who had fought to fight had found it distressing and generously unwelcome. It was a slow, painful process of reintegration into a world that had moved on without them. Many soldiers, like Miller, had seen their lives and their identities irrevocably changed. Before the war, Miller had been an ordinary young man, dreaming of a future filled with possibility. But now the weight of his experiences, his comrades lost, the daily grind of survival, the horror of trench warfare, was something that could not be erased. It wasn't just the physical injuries or the loss of friends, it was the psychological scars that he would carry with him forever. Henry found work in a factory, but it was hard to focus on anything beyond the memories. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The horrors of war would replay in his mind. Bodies torn apart, the constant stench of decay, the sounds of gunfire, and the screams of men who had not been so fortunate. One evening, as he walked back home, Henry passed a memorial to the fallen soldiers. The faces of the men who had died in the war seemed to stare out from the marble, etched forever in time. He stopped, remembering his fallen comrades, those who had stood beside him in the trenches and never made it home. It was a quiet moment, but it helped him find some peace. The soldiers' faces may have been gone, but their sacrifice was not forgotten. For Henry and his fellow soldiers, the war was not just a chapter in history, it was a lived experience, one that shaped their perceptions of the world. Many veterans, like Henry, were left grappling with the deep psychological scars of what they had witnessed. The mental toll of the war was not something easily seen, but it was something that would linger for years to come. The world around them was changing rapidly. The Russian Revolution had sparked a wave of political upheaval, and in Germany, the rise of Adolf Hitler would lead to the beginnings of World War II. For the veterans who had fought in World War I, the horrors of the past were never far from their minds. They had seen the devastation that war could cause, and many feared that the peace they had fought for was fragile. In the years after the war, a sense of disillusionment took hold in Europe. The Great War had promised to be the war to end all wars, but it had only planted the seeds for a much larger and more destructive conflict. The sacrifices made by millions seemed to have been in vain. In the midst of this uncertainty, Henry and his fellow soldiers found solace for sadness and pain. They formed small groups, keeping in touch, sharing their experiences, and providing each other with the support they so desperately needed. It was through this camaraderie that many found a sense of healing, even if the scars would never fully disappear. The term lost generation became widely used in the aftermath of World War I, describing the young men and women who had come of age during the war and were left with a sense of profound disillusionment. They had experienced the horrors of modern warfare and returned to a world that seemed to have moved on without them. The ideals of patriotism, duty, and honor that had once been held so dear seemed hollow in the face of the devastation that they had witnessed. For many soldiers, including Henry Miller, this sense of loss was overwhelming. The war had promised so much, yet delivered so little. The promises of peace had been shattered, and the world seemed increasingly fragmented. Henry had fought for a cause he believed in, but the reality of that cause, when viewed through the lens of the war's destruction, left him feeling empty. The lost generation sought refuge in art, literature, and music. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Wilfred Owen captured the disillusionment of their peers, giving voice to the feelings that so many veterans had trouble articulating. Hemingway, who had served as an ambulance driver during the war, wrote about the futility of violence and the deep emotional scars it left on people. The themes of existential struggle and the questioning of traditional values resonated deeply with men like Henry. The desire to live and make a good life for oneself came through in the work. But despite this deep sense of loss, there was also a powerful sense of resilience. The lost generation might have felt as though they had lost their way, but in many cases it was their very survival that helped them rebuild. Many veterans like Henry found ways to navigate the harsh realities of post-war life by relying on the friendships they had forged in the trenches. The bonds of comradeship forged in the face of death were unbreakable, and those bonds would serve as a source of strength for the years to come. In the absence of institutional support, many veterans turned to each other for comfort. Henry found solace in meeting regularly with his fellow soldiers at a local veterans' hall. They spoke in hushed tones about their shared experiences, discussing the things that could not be spoken of in the presence of family or friends. Henry had come to understand that the horrors of the war were too much for most civilians to grasp, but the men who had been there, they understood. They had lived it. They had endured. Despite his struggles, Henry also found moments of healing. He joined a group that helped other returning soldiers transition back to civilian life. Together, they worked on projects aimed at providing mental health care for veterans, using their collective experiences to advocate for better support and recognition of the toll war took on the human mind. Slowly but surely, Henry began to feel a sense of purpose again, knowing that his experiences could help others who were suffering in silence. The battle within continued, but with time, the men who had fought in the trenches found new ways to face their demons. The scars of war would never fully heal, but by supporting one another, they were able to move forward, one step at a time. As Henry looked back on his time in the trenches, he knew that his generation, like all generations before it, had left a legacy. It was a legacy defined by sacrifice, by the willingness to fight for a cause, and by the unimaginable toll that war had exacted. For Henry, the true meaning of that legacy was not in the victory or the defeat. It was in the resilience of the men who had lived through it, and in the enduring strength of their shared bonds. Though the world had moved on, Henry Miller knew that he and his comrades would never forget what they had endured. Their legacy lived on in the stories they shared, the friendships they had formed, and the lessons they had learned. It was a legacy not of glory, but of survival. A reminder that, even in the face of the darkest horrors, the human spirit could endure. The Battle of Verdun, which began in February 1916, was one of the longest and bloodiest battles of World War I. Among the soldiers who fought there was Corporal Augustin Trébuchon, a French soldier who would become one of the many casualties in what was referred to as the Hell of Verdun. The Germans had launched a massive offensive in an attempt to bleed France dry by forcing them to defend the symbolic fortress city. For the French, Verdun was more than just a military objective. It was a matter of national pride. Over 60,000 men, Corporal Trébuchon, like many other soldiers, had little idea of the true scale of what was about to unfold. The early days of the battle were filled with anticipation as the French troops took their positions in the trenches, awaiting the first wave of German attacks. The trenches themselves were a hellish landscape, flooded with rainwater, lined with mud, and filled with the smell of death and decay. Food was scarce, and there was little respite from the constant bombardment. Trébuchon, whose letters to his family had painted an idealized picture of soldiering, soon found that the reality was far different. "The Germans are relentless," he wrote in one of his letters, his handwriting shaky. "The bombardment never ends. The sky is always grey. I don't know how much longer we can hold out." On the front lines of Verdun, it wasn't just the soldiers who fought. Behind the front lines were medics like Dr. Pierre Desclos, who had volunteered to serve with the French army. Desclos had been working tirelessly for weeks, performing surgeries on soldiers who had been wounded by artillery shrapnel, gas attacks, and rifle fire. The number of casualties were always overcrowded, and many men died before they could be treated. "I've never seen anything like this before," Dr. Desclos confided to one of his fellow doctors. "The scale of it is incomprehensible. It's as though we're fighting not just to win, but simply to survive another day. Those who survive, others might, but we're not yet ready." In the spring of 1915, the Germans unleashed a new and terrifying weapon at the Second Battle of Ypres: poison gas. For soldiers like Private John Jack O'Connor, a Canadian who had joined the British Army, the chemical attack came as a shock. Jack and his comrades had been stationed near the front lines when they first noticed the eerie yellow-green haze creeping across the battlefield. Jack's battalion had been fighting for weeks, holding the line in the muddy, waterlogged trenches. When the first chlorine gas shells landed, there was confusion. Most of the men had never encountered such a weapon before. No one knew what to do, and many soldiers panicked. They had been trained for the horrors of machine gun fire, shelling, and rifle ambushes. But gas was a different beast altogether. The men who inhaled the gas began to choke, coughing up blood and gasping for air, as their lungs were burned from the inside out. It was in these moments that the importance of gas masks became apparent. Jack and his comrades, who had managed to find their masks in time, were left to watch helplessly as their fellow soldiers, those who had not been so lucky, others suffered from asphyxiation. Others collapsed from asphyxiation. Others collapsed from asphyxiation. As Jack struggled to maintain his composure, he thought of his family back home in Canada. He had written them letters, assuring them that he was safe and in good health. But the reality of war, especially the new dangers posed by chemical warfare, was far from the reassuring words he had written. "It's like a nightmare," Jack wrote in his diary that night, his hands shaking from the stress. "I saw men die in ways I couldn't have imagined. This war isn't what I thought it would be. It's worse." Jack's body stiffened up as he approached home. Jack ran to his study. It seemed hard to imagine. His mind was greatly shaken and his face red from cold and terror. Despite the carnage, Jack and his fellow soldiers fought on, determined to hold the line. But the poisoned gas had forever altered the way they saw the battlefield. They were no longer fighting just against enemy soldiers, but against an invisible enemy that could strike without warning, causing death in ways that left the body maimed and unrecognizable. On the civilian side of the war, life was equally harsh. Families were torn apart by the conflict, and whole villages were wiped off the map. One such town was Étaplé, located near the French coast. Situated not far from the front lines, the town became the site of a large military base for both French and British troops. For Claire Boudet, a 23-year-old woman living in Étaplé, the war had changed everything. As the war dragged on, the town's civilian population had been subjected to constant bombardments. The once quiet streets were now filled with soldiers, and the town had become a strategic target for German forces. Claire's family had already suffered the loss of her older brother Pierre, who had been killed in the Battle of the Somme. Now she found herself caring for her younger brother, Henri, who had been conscripted into the French army. Claire worked in a local hospital, helping to care for the wounded soldiers who were brought in after battles. She had witnessed firsthand the human cost of the war: wounded men, their limbs blown off, their faces unrecognizable, and their spirits broken. In one particularly harrowing incident, a group of soldiers who had been injured in a nearby skirmish were brought in for treatment. One of them, a young man who looked no older than 18, had suffered severe burns after a shell exploded near him. Claire had been tasked with dressing his wounds. As she carefully applied bandages to his charred skin, the young man, whose eyes wide with gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "I don't think I'll survive this." But Claire simply nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had lost count of how many soldiers had said those same words to her. The war had drained her of all but a few emotions: exhaustion, grief, and the faint hope that somehow, when the war was over, life could begin again. All life had begun to look One of the largest and bloodiest battles of World War I, the Battle of the Somme, began in July 1916. The battle was intended to break through the German lines and relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. Among those who fought there was Lieutenant Colonel Wilfred Owen, an English poet who had enlisted in the British Army. Owen, like many others, had joined the army in 1915, believing that it was his duty to fight for his country. But as the battle raged on, Owen began to question the patriotism and heroism that had led him to enlist. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, with its disastrous losses, shattered his illusions about the nature of war. Owen had been stationed near the front lines, and after witnessing the deaths of many of his comrades in a futile attack, he began writing poetry that captured the raw, unfiltered horror of war. His works, such as Dulce et decorum est, would later become some of the most poignant anti-war poems in history. Owen wrote about the brutality of trench life, the misery of soldiers, and the lie of glory in battle. "We are not heroes," he wrote in one letter to a friend. "We are victims. Victims of a war that will never be justified." End quote. As the first Christmas of World War I approached, the soldiers on the Western Front were weary and demoralized. Among them was Private Frederick Heath of the British Army. Heath, like many others, found solace in the letters he received from home, which reminded him of better times and offered a brief escape from the horrors of war. On Christmas Eve 1914, something unexpected happened. As night fell, the guns fell silent. Heath and his comrades noticed small lights appearing along the German trench lines. The Germans had decorated their trenches with candles and Christmas trees, and soon they began singing carols. Heath and his fellow soldiers were astonished when they heard the familiar tune of Stille Nacht filling in the Canny beneath the sky. Still Nacht, across no man's land. Heath couldn't believe his eyes when he saw German soldiers climbing out of their trenches and walking towards the British lines, hands raised in a gesture of peace. Tentatively, Heath and his comrades did the same. The two sides met in the middle of no man's land, exchanging greetings, gifts, and even playing a game of football. For a brief moment, the spirit of Christmas transcended the hatred and violence that had defined their lives for months. In his letter home, Heath described the truce with a sense of wonder. "It was as if the war had been forgotten," he wrote. "We were just men, celebrating Christmas together. It was a glimpse of humanity amidst the madness." Nursing played a crucial role in World War I, and few were more dedicated than Edith Cavell. A British nurse working in German-occupied Belgium, Cavell was known for her tireless work caring for soldiers on both sides of the conflict. She also became involved in helping Allied soldiers escape from occupied Belgium to neutral Holland, a risky endeavour that ultimately led to her arrest by German authorities. Cavell's arrest in August 1915 sent shockwaves through the international community. She was charged with treason and, despite international pleas for clemency, was executed by a German firing squad on October 12, 1915. Before her execution, Cavell remained calm and composed, her last words reflecting her unwavering commitment to her duty and her faith. "Patriotism is not enough," she said monically. She replied, "Monsieur, I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone." Her execution galvanized public opinion and became a rallying point for the Allied cause. Cavell's legacy lived on, inspiring countless others to serve and sacrifice in the name of humanity. Her story was a poignant reminder of the personal courage and resilience displayed by many during the war. Execution galvanized. Cavell's legacy lived on during the war to come soon. The Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, began in July 1917 and lasted until November of that year. It was one of the most brutal battles of the war, characterized by relentless rain, deep mud, and staggering casualties. Among those who fought there was Arthur Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps. Currie had proven himself to be a competent and innovative leader, and he was tasked with capturing the village of Passchendaele. The conditions were appalling. The battlefield had become a quagmire, with soldiers and equipment frequently getting stuck in the mud. Despite the challenges, Currie led his men with determination and skill. The Canadians made slow but steady progress, capturing key positions despite heavy resistance from the German forces. The cost was high, with over 100 Canadian casualties. Currie later reflected on the battle, acknowledging both the bravery of his men and the horrific conditions they endured. "It was a battle of mud, blood, and sacrifice," he said, "but we fought on because that is what we had to do." While the soldiers fought on the front lines, those at home also faced their own struggles. In Britain, the war effort required the mobilization of the entire population, and women played a critical role in keeping the country running. One such woman was Vera Brittain, who worked as a voluntary aid detachment, VADOS, Grattan Sally. Brittain had initially been a student at Oxford University, but she left her studies to serve as a nurse when the war broke out. She worked in military hospitals in England, Malta, and France, witnessing firsthand the physical and emotional toll of the war on the soldiers she cared for. Her fiancé, brother, and 2 close friends were all killed in the conflict, and Brittain's experiences profoundly shaped her views on the war. After the war, Brittain wrote Testament of Youth, a memoir that detailed her experiences and the devastating impact of the war on her generation. Her writing captured the disillusionment and grief felt by many who had lived through the conflict. "There is nothing more awful than the recognition of lost potential," she wrote. "So many young lives, full of promise, cut short." The entry of the United States into World War I in April 1917 marked a turning point in the conflict. One of the key figures in mobilizing American support for the war was General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF. Pershing was tasked with transforming a relatively small peacetime army into a formidable fighting force capable of making a significant impact on the Western Front. Under Pershing's leadership, American troops began arriving in France in large numbers. The arrival of fresh, well-supplied American soldiers provided a much-needed boost to the weary Allied forces. Pershing insisted that American units fight as independent formations rather than being integrated into British and French units, a decision that helped maintain the morale and identity of the American forces. One of the first major engagements involving American troops was the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918. The American 1st Division, under the command of Major General Robert Lee Bullard, successfully captured the village of Cantigny from the Germans. The victory, though small in scale, demonstrated the effectiveness and resolve of the American forces and boosted Allied morale. The term "lost generation" was coined to describe the young men and women whose lives were profoundly affected by World War I. Among them was Ernest Hemingway, who served as an ambulance driver for the Italian Red Cross. Hemingway was severely wounded by mortar fire in July 1918, and his experiences in the war would later influence his writing. Mohammed Medingrad. Hemingway's novel A Farewell to Arms, published in 1929, drew heavily on his wartime experiences. The book tells the story of an American ambulance driver in the Italian army and his love affair with a British nurse. Through his writing, Hemingway captured the disillusionment and trauma felt by many who had lived through the war. "The world breaks everyone," Hemingway wrote, "and afterward many are strong at the broken places." His words resonated with a generation that had witnessed unprecedented destruction and loss. The war had shattered the old world order, and those who survived were left to pick up the pieces and forge a new path forward. As World War I drew to a close, a new and deadly enemy emerged, the Spanish flu. The influenza pandemic of 1919 killed more people than the war itself, spreading rapidly through military camps and civilian populations alike. Soldiers, returning home from the front lines, unwittingly carried the virus with them, leading to widespread outbreaks, suppressing trade and restoring civilian populations alike. Soldiers returning home from the front lines unwittingly carried the virus with them. One of the victims of the Spanish flu was Walt Disney, who contracted the virus while serving as a Red Cross ambulance driver in France. Disney survived, but the pandemic left a lasting impact on the world. The war had already taken a devastating toll, and the flu pandemic compounded the suffering. In letters and diaries, people wrote about the fear and uncertainty brought by the flu. Communities were overwhelmed. Hospitals were filled beyond capacity, and many families lost loved ones. The pandemic was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of global events. The armistice that ended World War I was signed on November 11th, 1918, bringing an end to the fighting on the Western Front. For soldiers like Henry Gunther, an American soldier who was killed just minutes before the armistice took effect, the war had come too late. Gunther's death was a tragic reminder of the cost of the conflict. In the days and weeks following the armistice, soldiers and civilians alike grappled with the enormity of what had happened. The war had changed the world in profound ways, redrawing borders, toppling empires, and leaving millions dead or wounded. For those who survived, the task of rebuilding and moving forward was daunting. Among the survivors was Sergeant Alvin York, one of the most decorated American soldiers of the war. York, a devout Christian and conscientious objector, had initially sought exemption from military service. However, he ultimately served with distinction, capturing 132 German soldiers single-handedly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. After the war, York returned to his home in Tennessee, where he dedicated himself to improving education and economic opportunities for his fellow veterans. The story of World War I is one of immense sacrifice, resilience, and courage. Through the experiences of individuals like Frederick Heath, Edith Cavell, Arthur Curry, Vera Brittain, John J. Pershing, Ernest Hemingway, and Alvin York, we gain a deeper understanding of the human cost of war. Their story reminds us of the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.